murder. Residents were terrified.
This poor woman was covered head to foot in bruises.
And burn marks applied with a domestic iron.
It was just shocking. There's no other word for it.
He was a manipulative psychopath. He is a very dangerous individual.
She described him as a monster.
He's shown no remorse or no responsibility.
That level of evil demonstrates that he's a danger to any woman.
Just south of Derby city centre lies the bustling former village of Normanton.
It's a very multicultural area. People from all different parts of the world live there.
It really embraces diversity. I think at one time there was over 100 different languages and dialects spoken within that area.
It's also quite a close-knit community. A lot of people sort of know each other. Families tend to live quite close to each other, and they socialise in family and friend circles.
There's a lot of families that have lived there for many years, and as a consequence of that, people know each other's business and they're there to support each other when things might not go so well.
The communities sort of live together and work together. It does feel like a village in that environment.
It's somewhere that's always very, very busy, very, very vibrant, and there's always a lot of people on the streets, no matter what time of day it is.
In the heart of Normanton is Pear Tree Crescent.
Pear Tree Crescent has a distinct feel about it, and with it being on a crescent, it's quite contained. Families know their neighbours, and it's not a through road, so it's probably quite a quiet crescent without busy traffic going through it. So it's easy to see how it might have a community feel about it.
But life in this little backwater is about to change forever.
Emergency service.
The police received a call to say there'd been an incident in Normanton.
The report is in relation to an address on Pear Tree Crescent.
A man said that there was a body in the house.
So immediately the police were put into place. An immediate response to go to the address might be that they are not dead. So one of the fundamentals of policing is around protecting life.
Police go to the address on Pear Tree Crescent. They try to gain entry to the address. There's no reply there, so the decision's made to force entry. They force the front door because they're concerned about the safety of the people that may be inside the address. Once inside the address, they go upstairs and they enter the bathroom.
They found the body of a female in the bath.
The young woman is Asian and in her late 30s.
They find her in an unusual position. She is sat in the bath, she has got a towel over her, and she's got a shower curtain over her as well.
The shower rail had been pulled down and was lying on top of her or very close to her body in the bath.
And it was very quickly ascertained that she was dead.
And it was quite obvious to them that she had suffered catastrophic injuries.
This poor woman was covered head to foot in bruises. It was horrific, dreadful.
She has been savagely beaten around the head, face and limbs.
They will have been very quickly aware of the types of injuries that had occurred, and that, you know, to all intents and purposes, this wasn't a natural death. You know, it had been the subject of a violent assault.
And that this was a sadistic and brutal murder, and not just any other murder.
What the police did notice when they went into the bathroom was that the lock on the door was forced.
And I think that the police would have been weighing up the possibility that she had been trying to run away from her attacker.
She has been trying to seek refuge. She's tried to find a place in the house where she could go, where she could lock the door, and hopefully help would come.
Police descended on the street. They came from a number of police stations within just a couple of miles of the scene, cordoned off the road. I vividly remember forensics were onto the scene extremely quickly. Residents were told to stay indoors. They were completely stunned and shocked by what had happened.
The scenes of crimes officers come in, unpeeling the layers of the crime scene, whether that's fingerprints, whether that's DNA. Things like the shower curtain would have been collected and bagged and tagged, taken away for further examination, etc., working through the crime scene.
As investigators carry out house-to-house inquiries, the top priority for police is to get a name for the victim.
It's the police who should be going and finding the family of that person and telling them their loved ones has passed away. What you can't do is allow social media or any other method of that person's name getting out before the family knows. It's incumbent on the police to get that identity at the earliest opportunity.
The woman identified as living at the property is 37-year-old Sobia Khan.
I have a general recollection that she was, by all accounts, a terrific woman.
She was from Bradford. She had moved to Derby in the previous weeks.
She's worked with children for 4 years in Bradford, for young kids, as a play worker.
She was a very friendly, very kind and polite woman, having spoken to those people around her. She loved children. She had a huge passion for her job, had absolutely everything to live for.
A very bright, very intelligent young woman, but she was very family-orientated as well.
Sobia was loved and adored by her family. Her brother described her as the light of the family. She didn't have any children, but played a massive part in the lives of the children in the family and also those older members, and almost acted like the glue of the family. She brought a lot of people together and brought joy and happiness to those other people in her life.
And I think one of her life goals was to have children and, you know, to have a family of her own.
In a heartbreaking way, that was cut tragically short.
News of the murder comes on one of the holiest days for local Muslims, the beginning of Ramadan.
Residents were terrified. This is a sort of peaceful street in Normanton. It's quite well-to-do, quite respected street, and I just remember them being absolutely shocked by what was unfolding in front of them.
In Normanton, it would probably have the same effect as anywhere else. The community are justifiably shocked and, to an element, scared as well. But I think it's like a lot of communities where this type of crime takes place, that the communities kind of come together and rally round.
You don't get anything of this magnitude in Normanton, barely ever. Something of this scale, something this unique, is extremely rare.
The body is carefully removed and sent for a post-mortem.
The pathology report was horrendous and painted a picture of the most brutal murder possible. There was 36 injuries all over her body. It was clear multiple weapons had been used.
And these injuries haven't been inflicted in one go. They've been inflicted over a period of time. They involve burn marks, which are consistent with being applied with a domestic iron. There are marks where Sobia's been hit with an implement. There's also blunt force trauma, which is feet and fists.
It was a very prolonged and systematic attack. It wasn't something that was very instantaneous, so this had been going on for some time.
Which must have been an absolutely awful experience to undergo. Just a terrible, terrifying ordeal that she's been put through.
The precise cause of death, as far as I can remember, was not ascertainable. She died from her injuries, this poor woman.
The type of person responsible for something like this is evil, sadistic, and without any humanity.
It was just shocking. There's no other word for it. It was just shocking. It was horrific.
In order to track this brutal killer, investigators continue to comb for clues left at the scene.
Police will try to work out exactly what had happened to Sobia, and a murder weapon or weapons would have been high on their priority.
The physical search of the property is really successful. There's a couple of items that are found early on which are really helpful to the inquiry. There is a rod that is found down the back of a radiator. There is a piece of wood that looks like it may have been from a coat hanger,
which it was suggested was responsible for some of the injuries that she sustained.
As part of their search, police found a domestic iron that was found in a wheelie bin at the rear of the property.
And this is consistent with some of the burn injuries, and the distinctive shape of the iron matches the injuries that Sobia has on her body. So the next concern for the police is who is the perpetrator for this. And the worrying thing is for the police at this point is that somebody may have committed a murder and they're out in the public and they're free to go and do whatever it is that they want to. If they want to flee, if they want to destroy evidence. So there's a real sense of urgency now to try and establish who the perpetrator is and get them under arrest at the earliest opportunity.
Investigators trace Sobia's extended family who live nearby.
They speak to a man who is there. And it turns out that this man is the person who called the emergency services and tells them that an incident has taken place on Pear Tree Crescent. He tells the police that his brother had confessed to murdering Sobia Khan. He is Sobia's husband, Atwell Mustafa.
In Normanton, Derbyshire, 37-year-old Sobia Khan has been found at home in her bath, beaten to death. Police need to trace her husband, Atwell Mustafa, urgently. He hasn't been seen since.
By this point, police have interviewed at length and thoroughly family members, and they would have concluded that Atwell Mustafa is the prime suspect. When I saw the photo, I sat there and I remember looking at it on my computer screen thinking, here is a woman who looks free, who looks happy, who looks joyful, who's got a whole future ahead of her.
Her family says Sobia is considered very vibrant and outgoing. She's very keen on social media and socialising.
And that was not the sort of account that residents were giving me who were living nearby the house. That was not the sort of life that they had seen her live.
Investigators put Atwell and Sobia's married life together under the microscope.
They established from the family that Atwell had met Sobia in and around May 2016. It was around that time that she said that she'd met somebody and wanted to get married.
And she wanted to leave the family home at Bradford and go and relocate at Derby to be with this person. This came as huge news to Sobia's family. They'd never met who this person was. They didn't know where he lived, what he did, and although they were happy for her, they were also very cautious as well, because they cared about her and they wanted to make sure that she was going into a supportive relationship, and they just didn't have that information immediately available to them.
During their courtship, Atwell decides to meet Sobia's family in Bradford. But bizarrely, he does so undercover, posing as a social worker.
He turns up, identifies himself as Asif, and quite quickly, Sobia's brother starts to become suspicious of this man and wonders whether he is who he actually says he is.
I think what Mustafa was doing was using this as a ruse to try and check on the family, to see what sort of people they were.
He was very kind of secretive in terms of his background and who he was.
Sobia's family, in the days after, put two and two together and realised that this man was not a social worker and was actually in a relationship with her. And I think that certainly gave them great concern and worry This was not something that she had done before, and I think it sparked a lot of fear among her family members that this was a path that she was going down.
And as a police officer, I then start to question, why would this person invent such an account to try and find out about another family in such a secretive, clandestine way? It does make you wonder what his motives are for this.
A few months later, in August 2016, Atwell tries to make his intentions towards Sobia clear.
What Atwell does is he arranges then for his family in Derby to travel to Bradford to meet Sobia's family. And again, this is all part of the two families getting to know each other.
Mustafa travelled with the intention of trying to get their approval for marriage plans, and he basically came with gifts to try and woo them and persuade them, and he would do anything he could to try and get what he wanted.
He continued to court the family, to ingratiate himself within that family environment and win people over.
But Sobia's family remain unimpressed with her new suitor.
Sobia's family warned her that this was a terrible idea, and they tried their absolute best to say that going to Derby was a bad idea and that this man was not right for her. Unfortunately, she would not accept this and did not believe it.
Time passes by and we are into April 2017, and Sobia contacts her friend who's a beautician, and she tells her the great news that she's going to be getting married and she's looking to book some treatments. So it seems to be quite an exciting time for her. On the 19th of April 2017, Mustafa collects Sobia from Bradford and he takes her to Derby and they move in together.
When they came to get married at their home in Derby, there was hardly anybody there. The imam was a friend of Mustafa. It's clear that the ceremony was a sham.
It was a very small ceremony. It was very informal, probably not the sort of wedding that she had dreamed of. Her family were not there.
And there's a considerable doubt whether it can properly be described as a marriage. But she may well have believed that they were actually married because of this ceremony that he'd set up.
It was hidden, it was done very quickly, almost a feel to get the ceremony over with.
I think it was also a way of exerting control over her, telling her that she was now beholden to her husband. It seems that he suggested to Sobia that when she joined him in Derby, she would become completely isolated from family and friends. It was clear that he wanted her relationship to be solely with him, and he was going to cut her off from the family.
Just a day after the marriage, all of her social media profiles were deleted.
And it's clear that this was his ongoing attempt and decision to isolate her completely, both physically and virtually, from her family and friends. She was quite a gregarious, outgoing, independent-minded person. So this points to the degree of control and manipulation that he was able to exert.
She finds herself in a strange city without that support network around her, and this is a really worrying event in the timeline.
Police uncover records of something even more sinister, which occurred that same day.
Sobia presented at the Derby Royal Infirmary with abdominal pains.
There's no indication as to what that was, but I think there's certainly a fear that this was the start of a campaign of domestic abuse that she had started to suffer.
On the 1st of May, we see yet another worrying turn in this saga. Sobia phones her family up and confesses that she's been having an affair. Now, A family aren't entirely convinced about this phone call, and what it seems is that somebody's in the background telling her exactly what to say. Bizarrely, a few moments after this phone call has taken place, Mustafa then phones up. He says it was all a joke and he's forgiven her and there's actually no problems. These clearly aren't the normal things to do during the course of a normal relationship. It really starts to demonstrate a pattern of controlling behaviour.
2 days later, Mustafa and Sobia went to Bradford to see her family, and they were shocked when she walked in the house. She was wearing a full veil, a niqab, and her hands and face were completely covered. This was something they'd never seen before. They didn't see it in their own family. She was very westernised, so this was really, really out of character.
This is a very, very different person, and it is quite clear that Mustafa has now got absolute control.
Sobia then disappears off the face of the earth until her brother receives a disturbing phone call.
Sobia calls her brother up, then starts accusing him of inappropriate behaviour when they were both children. Now, this has never taken place, and it's almost like Sobia's reading from a script, and that Mustafa's in the background and she is just going through the motions of doing exactly what he wants her to say.
Sobia's brother, during that call, got really, really angry, to the point where he just threw the phone and said, "I'm not having this conversation."
She was clearly saying this, again, under coercion from Mustafa. And this seems to be a pattern where he is using her to make accusations against her family, a further attempt to split her off from her family. And again, it's an expression of his sadistic, aggressive behaviour to make her even more isolated and under his power and control.
Mustafa's own family tell investigators about the morning they discovered Sobia was dead.
His mum said that she was terrified as to what Mustafa had done. He had come to her door and had asked her to come back to his house. She locked the door and did not want to go. His family members were telling her, "Do not go," which I think is very disturbing that that was going through their mind, and gives you an indication as to what they know this man is capable of.
But Mustafa persuades his mother to get in the car.
The mother goes to Pear Crescent, and she's directed upstairs.
And so she went up to the bathroom, not really knowing what to expect.
And sees Sobia in the bath. She said, "Sobia, why are you taking a bath at this time?"
She asks her if she's all right, and it's at that point that she realises she's not conscious.
And there was Sobia lying covered, head to foot in injuries.
And then she realised she was dead. Mustafa's mum confronted him and said, "Why have you killed her?" And he denied it. He claimed that she was just unconscious. She did not believe it. She knew what he had done. And she said, "You have killed her."
Atwell's mum breaks the news to his brother, who in turn calls the police. When interviewed by detectives, Mustafa's family reveal he could be hiding out at his uncle's house.
They tell police that it's an address that he may frequent. And that leads the police pretty quickly to go and visit that address. And they find Mustafa there, and they arrest him for murder.
In Normanton, Derbyshire, Atwell Mustafa has been arrested on suspicion of the murder of his newlywed wife, Sobia Khan. Police examine her husband's movements in the last 24 hours before his arrest.
So what the investigation discovered subsequently is that Mustafa, from his relative's house, has used a mobile phone to contact his solicitor. He's then discarded that mobile phone, which is perhaps an indication of his intent to evade capture.
And then he's bought flights to Pakistan, clearly with the intention of fleeing the country and escaping the jurisdiction in the hope that he can evade justice.
And he finally phoned an ambulance to try and get what he said was help. I believe this was a cynical and twisted ploy to try and avoid responsibility for what he had done and cover his tracks.
The good thing that we have at this point is the person that the police believe to be the perpetrator is in custody, so any ongoing risk to the public is mitigated. But they're also under a lot of pressure now, because there's only so long that you can keep somebody in custody and interview them and start to build your case.
Investigators uncover that Atwell Mustafa has a sinister history.
He was, in fact, a psychiatric patient currently under psychiatric care and supervision who had previously carried out a serious offence.
They would have found an incredibly horrific case from 2008. This would have rang massive alarm bells.
Mustafa holds an ex-partner captive in his home for 4 days.
She was assaulted, raped, her underwear was set on fire while she was wearing it.
He tortured her, he did some horrendous acts to her.
He completely abused this woman. He repeatedly beat her. He shaved off her hair, he shaved off her eyebrows.
He mutilated her. He caused a wide range of injuries to her. They were truly horrific.
All of this was while he was accusing her of falsely having an affair. It was an absolutely horrific campaign of domestic abuse on a truly savage scale.
She finally managed to escape from him. She ran to a shop where the police were called and he was arrested. This sadistic assault, which included a sexual assault, bore striking similarities to the subsequent assault and murder of Sobia 9 years later.
Mustafa's arrested in 2008. The police investigation progresses and he goes to court charged with grievous bodily harm and rape as well. Mustafa pleads guilty to the grievous bodily harm.
He said that she had in fact provoked him and that he had been justified in attacking her.
But he denies the rape, so the case has to go to trial. And thankfully, he's subsequently convicted of those rapes. He's found guilty.
I spoke to his former partner and a support worker on her behalf on the day that he was sentenced, and it was clear, completely clear, that what he had done to her had devastated her life, had destroyed her, and had had a profound and disturbing impact on everything around her.
So again, during this investigation, there's the parallels between 2008 and 2017. You have this controlling, coercive behaviour where Mustafa is accusing his partner back in 2008 of being unfaithful, about having affairs. And this is the same behaviour that's then repeated in 2016, 2017 with Sobia. And this is a really worrying development when the police find this, because he's done this before.
And it seems at the time of his sentencing, Mustafa has a trick up his sleeve.
Following his conviction, Mustafa started to display psychiatric symptoms, none of which had been evident prior to the offences. He had no psychiatric history, but he managed to persuade psychiatrists that he was suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, as a result of which he was not sentenced to prison and he was admitted to a secure psychiatric hospital rather than being imprisoned. This meant that his care was now under the supervision of psychiatrists, and he could be released after his mental illness, if he had one, had improved without any need to go back to prison.
At the secure unit in Nottinghamshire, Mustafa starts planning his path to freedom.
Quite early on, you start to see the seeds of what is manipulative behaviour there. You start to see that he's trying to ingratiate himself to staff, he's buying gifts, and he's mainly trying to portray this image of being a model patient.
He started to do some work on the farm shop there, and he felt that this was a way to try and sort of reintegrate in society and come across as a sort of normal, ordinary guy, and actually hide his true nature.
And again, this is all about him trying to prove to the staff that he can be trusted, that he can go and interact with members of the community, and in actual fact, he presents no risk whatsoever.
Mustafa is moved to a lower security unit in Derby to start a sex offenders treatment programme, which was a requirement of his sentence.
He was moved nearer his home, where he manipulated the system again by suggesting that he had already carried out treatment programs which he had not done.
He was supposed to take a program for sex offenders. Somehow he managed not to do that. He hoodwinked the system and got out of it.
He's probably 25 minutes walk from his home address on Pear Tree Crescent, so he's getting even closer to his home, and he's managing to convince the people around him that he's no longer a risk.
His escorted leave, where he goes out with staff, is changed to unescorted, so he's allowed out on his own, ostensibly to go to Friday prayers. So again, he's manipulating the system. He's persuading staff to let him out unescorted because they believe that he's no longer showing any symptoms of illness, whereas in fact he still remains a dangerous, psychopathic, personality disordered individual.
Atwell's unescorted leave is meant to be spent with his family, but left to his own devices at home, he has other plans.
He had formed a clandestine relationship with a member of staff who was there to look after him. This was strictly against the rules that he had been set because he was supposed to inform the authorities of any relationships that he was forming.
And it was following her disclosing to her employers that she'd had this relationship. She also identified his aggressive tendencies, his manipulative, his threatening behaviours.
With a healthcare professional, he tells her that her phone is bugged, he threatens violence, he seeks to control her. It's really coercive behaviour, and it's brought about by this jealousy that he seems to have.
It would have meant the end of her job, but such was her fear and the level of control that Mustafa had started to wield over her, she felt she had no choice but to come clean.
The healthcare assistant is fired for gross misconduct, and Mustafa spreads unfounded allegations of inappropriate behaviour with other patients.
But interestingly, again, what he was able to do is manipulate his position in that relationship to demonstrate that he was the victim.
These are massive parallels between what he had done with Sobia. It was just a pack of lies, and it was deceitful, and he was hiding the truth and using any way he could to do that.
Mustafa is discharged just months before meeting Sobia. In spite of an order to inform the authorities of any new relationships, he fails to do so. As detectives build their case against their suspect, they uncover more damning evidence.
As part of the police investigation, they found a recording on Mustafa's phone from the 18th of April.
The conversation was between Atwell, or Mustafa, and Sobia, and within that conversation, he was saying how she was stupid, she, wasn't intelligent, really belittling her.
He'd been incredibly nasty and abusive towards her intellect and her family, and this was an important piece of evidence.
The recording is dated just 4 days before their wedding.
This, I think, is a disturbing insight into what he is like as a person and shows the sort of control and dominance and violence that he's later uses and was using at the time.
Investigators also uncover more worrying information in police records.
In October 2016, the police receive a safeguarding referral, and this referral is in relation to a young girl who fears that she will be victim of honour-based violence with respect to her uncle, and this uncle is Mustafa.
Detectives bring together all their findings on Mustafa.
The investigation team managed to get together a compelling case at this early stage. There is good witness evidence, there is good circumstantial evidence, and what they're able to do is convince the Crown Prosecution Service to charge Mustafa with murder.
Atwell Mustafa has been charged with the murder of his newly wedded wife Sobia Khan at their home in Normanton, Derbyshire.
So following his arrest and charge, Mustafa was remanded into HM Prison Nottingham, where he started to show very bizarre behaviour, because he was trying to get himself transferred to a psychiatric hospital, and he was trying to lay the groundwork for a psychiatric defence. He knew the system, and he wanted to try and plead guilty to manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility, claiming that he was mentally ill at the time, rather than be convicted of murder.
And a couple of months later, at his first court appearance, he pleaded not guilty to that murder.
Forensic psychiatrist Philip Joseph is asked to prepare a psychiatric report on Mustafa for the prosecution.
I was instructed by the Crown Prosecution Service to go and interview the defendant at the prison in order to determine whether there are any psychiatric factors which were implicated in the commission of the alleged offence. When I first met Mustafa, he told me that he hadn't expected a visit from me, although this had been organised with the prison authorities and his solicitor. And he then suggested that he remembered me from 2008, which was not correct, and may have been his attempt to give the impression that he was rather confused about the situation. He did, however, present as quite calm and cooperative, although later he appeared to be very distressed. For example, he was begging me to allow him to go to Sobia's funeral with what appeared to me not at all genuine distress. I felt very strongly that he was attempting to manipulate me as well and present himself as a mentally ill, harmless victim of the situation. When I interviewed him, he was at pains to suggest that Sobia was the one who was making the running in the relationship. She had suggested they get married, she had wanted him to meet her family, and she was totally in control of the relationship, and he was going along with it. Mustafa told me that in the period leading up to the killing, he was quite upset at Sobia's behaviour, the fact she was going online and talking to other men, that at times he didn't know whether he was taking his medication or not, sometimes he forgot, and he even suggested that Sobia had advised him to stop it, which is highly unlikely.
Mustafa also claims he suffered amnesia on the day of Sobia's murder.
So he told me he had no memory of killing her, but he does appear to remember things that put him in a better light. For example, that a man had come to the house whom he believed his wife was having an affair with, and also a memory of calling an ambulance. This selective memory also suggests that the amnesia is not genuine. I formed the opinion that he was a manipulative, dangerous, sadistic psychopath who was prone to excessive jealousy when in a possessive, controlling relationship with a woman. I was fairly confident that he was not mentally ill at the time of the killing, that he had never suffered from schizophrenia, and that he had no psychiatric defence to a charge of murder.
The trial finally begins against Atwell Mustafa. He continues to plead not guilty to Sobia's murder on the grounds of diminished responsibility.
The first day of the trial at Derby Crown Court was truly harrowing. The full scale of the abuse that Sobia had suffered was laid out at the prosecution opening of the trial. I vividly remember the victim's family attended court and had to listen to all of that harrowing detail. And it was truly shocking what had happened.
The jury's taken through the 30-plus injuries and torture that Sobia suffered, including the burn marks meted out on her body with an iron.
My first thought was, this man is a monster. The way in which he carried himself, the way in which he conducted himself with real arrogance and an air of superiority over the whole process, which I've never come across since.
Mustafa's team mounts his defence.
Mustafa tried to present a case that he wasn't fully in control of what he did.
We weren't suggesting that he hadn't committed this atrocious crime. We were suggesting, principally, that he had a serious mental problem. But the doctor for the prosecution took the view that he was not suffering from an abnormality of mental function, which provided him with a defence.
The jury went out to deliberate, and just 15 minutes later there was an announcement on the tannoy that they had come back with a verdict. That verdict was guilty.
Atwell Mustafa is jailed for life with a minimum of 33 years.
Mustafa laughed as he walked down to the cells. He'll be 69 before ever being considered for parole.
Sobia's brother, who asked not to show his face, gives his reaction to the sentence.
I'm supposed to protect my family. I wish I could have done something to stop it from happening. But he managed to play the system, he managed to dupe these people. I'd rather them learn from this, knowing that there's people out there that can manipulate and do what he's done to my sister.
A 6-week inquest later rules there were extensive failings by the authorities managing Mustafa.
I think the impact of the murder will remain and has remained with that community for many years to come. It's one of those shocking crimes that happened on an ordinary street in an ordinary city in Great Britain, but the ramifications have been huge.
An ambitious, popular young restaurant manager.
She was a tremendous young person who had unlimited potential.
We always thought, just light the world on fire.
Is found beaten, stabbed, and suffocated.
The person who did this absolutely wanted to guarantee that she was dead.
Whoever did it ransacked the safe. Something that brutal had to be more than just a robbery.
Detectives uncover a history of workplace conflict.
He didn't like to be told what to do.
He scared me. I was uncomfortable around him. For me, that was a red flag.
With the community on edge, another attack leaves them living in fear.
It was such a similar homicide, a lone female employee and the use of a knife.
You don't know if somebody's lurking out there and they're going to do it again.
And new evidence confirms disturbing suspicions.
The lab informed me that there was a match.
I just couldn't believe what was happening. Like, when am I going to wake up?
Terry's murder wasn't what it appeared to be.
Falls Township, Pennsylvania is a family-friendly suburb with blue-collar roots.
Falls Township is a community in Lower Bucks County, Pennsylvania. It was built up around the U.S. Steel Mill in the 1950s.
Steel workers moved out here from different parts of the country, and it was a nice community.
Although we're a suburb of Philadelphia and we're right across the river from Trenton, violent crime is relatively unusual in Falls.
That all changes one Saturday morning with a gruesome discovery at a fast food restaurant.
On the morning of February 4th, 1984, the manager arrived to open the restaurant, and upon entering, discovered that someone was laying outside the kitchen area and obviously deceased.
The manager recognizes the woman as the restaurant's night shift manager, 25-year-old Terry Brooks.
He observed Terry Brooks laying on the floor in a pool of blood with a knife stuck in her neck. And he phoned the dispatcher and stayed on the phone until officers got there. I was told that they had a homicide at the Roy Rogers restaurant on Route 1, so I was there pretty quickly. Her body was positioned near the kitchen. There was a butcher knife sticking out of her neck. She had black and blue marks and bruises everywhere, and it looked like hand marks around her neck, like she had been strangled. It was thought that she was still alive until the bag was put over her head because of the moisture in it from her breath. She looked like she had blood under her fingernails and blood on her hand, and that was wrapped in an evidence bag and secured.
There was a rectangular kitchen prep area. That's where you could see both her shoes that were against the wall. To my mind, that was probably the first act of violence that took place, that she was literally pushed right out of her shoes, and that a struggle had taken place right there. Moving around the corner is where the body was found.
It looked like her body had been dragged on the floor to where she laid. Terry had her winter coat on, and her bag was also on the floor, like she was getting ready to leave.
Further examination of the scene reveals evidence of another crime.
In the office, a safe was open. There was a register drawer on the desk.
The coins were scattered all over the floor. It just appeared that whoever did it ransacked the safe.
There was money taken. It had all the earmarkings of a robbery homicide. It was fairly easy for the restaurant to get a count of what was missing, and it was around $2,500.
Looking for more clues, detectives speak to the manager who discovered Terry's body.
When the manager of the restaurant arrived around 6 in the morning, he found the inner vestibule door locked.
The door to the interior of the building was locked, but the drive-through window was partially open.
It appeared that the killer had left through the drive-through window because the metal pipe that was laid in the track as the kind of security measure to lock it up had been removed and laid to the side. But there was no sign of forced entry in the restaurant.
Police believe Terry was killed sometime after midnight when the restaurant had closed. As detectives continue to process the crime scene, Terry's family discovers that she never returned home from work.
The morning of the murder, Scott, the victim's fiance, knocks on the door to the Brooks family home. At the time, Terry lived with her parents.
We hear a banging at the door, and it was Scott standing there, and he's like, Terry's car's not in the driveway.
He tells them that he was driving by their house on his way to work, and that he noticed Terry's car wasn't there. They then looked in her room and saw that, in fact, she wasn't home. And then Scott picked up the phone and dialed to Roy Rogers.
And he goes, this is George Brooks, Terry Brooks's father. You know, she didn't come home last night. Is she okay? And they said, no, she's not. She, you know, has been murdered. I was kind of shocked they told him over the phone, but I just couldn't believe what was happening. Like, when am I going to wake up? It's a horrible thing.
I was getting ready to go to work when my phone rang. I was getting a call from her stepmother to tell me so that I wouldn't see it on the news, and my heart just sunk.
Terry Brooks grew up in Warminster, Pennsylvania, the oldest of 4 children.
My mom and dad divorced. Terry was in 8th grade, and she kind of took over the mother role. After that happened, Out of all of us, she was probably the most ambitious. We always thought, you know, Terry would have her own business one day and she'd just light the world on fire.
Terry took jobs in the restaurant industry and earned a reputation as a hard worker.
I worked with Terry at an Italian restaurant. In the beginning, she was a server. I tended bar. She became management after working there for a while. She really, really took pride in her work and how she dealt with people.
Soon after her promotion, she began a year-long romance with her coworker, Scott Keefe.
She met Scott at the restaurant. He was the head chef. They had a good time together.
Terry just came home one day with a ring on her finger, and we were all like, oh my God.
While Terry planned her dream wedding for the upcoming summer, her career also started to take off.
It was her dream to move forward to bigger things in the hotel business. And she had looked into getting a job with the Marriott Corporation.
The positions she accepted with the Marriott was to be a manager of a Roy Rogers restaurant.
I first met Terry when I started working at the Roy Rogers. She was my boss. She was always happy. She was very excited about her wedding, and she was excited to go dress shopping.
I know she put the down payment on the honeymoon to Hawaii, and she was talking about the bridesmaid dresses.
Terry and Scott were apartment hunting. There was a lot to do. It was at a time when all new things were happening in her life.
Now, detectives must determine who could have killed this ambitious young woman just a few months before her wedding. They asked the family about Terry's movements in the hours leading up to her murder.
Mr. and Mrs. Brooks last saw Terry the day before, Friday, February 3rd, 1984, when she left for work.
Usually, her fiancé, Scott, would make sure that he went and closed with her every night. And her father was glad that Scott would go and close with her and be there to keep her safe.
Scott was worried about Terry's security at the restaurant. He would go and sit with her while she finished everything up.
Scott tells police he wasn't with Terry the night before. He had stayed home because he was working the early shift the following morning. Neither Scott nor Terry's parents are able to provide police with any leads.
The family was really cooperative with the investigation, and we just nothing that they could volunteer or give us that would indicate that they knew anything about the case.
It was completely out of the blue. There was no reason for them to feel that she was in any danger or in any jeopardy.
I couldn't think of anybody who really disliked Terry, and I can't imagine anybody would dislike her that much to kill her.
Investigators turned their attention to Terry's coworkers.
It looked like it could possibly be a robbery, but the deeper we looked into to see how brutally she was murdered, it had to be more than just a robbery.
Detectives want to know how Terry was thought of by her colleagues.
Terry was a young woman who was very staunch about the procedures, and she enforced them strictly.
She was a by-the-book person, and as long as you did your work the way you were supposed to, there were no problems.
When police ask if Terry's management style made her any enemies, one name keeps coming up.
Steve Daly was an employee that didn't adhere to the procedures. He was a little hot-headed.
Steve scared me, to be honest. He was very rough, quick to anger. I was uncomfortable around him.
Detectives learned that just weeks before the murder, the tension between Terry and Steve hit a breaking point.
He ended up getting fired, and he wasn't too happy about it.
You've got this former employee who had a clear animus towards the victim and is fired by the victim. And add to that that here's an employee who knows how the restaurant operates, who knows the security procedures. He's got the kind of knowledge to be able to commit this crime. So this is somebody who now rises to the top of the list.
Coming up, police zero in on a suspect.
Fingerprints were found on one of the murder weapons.
At that point, he admitted he took the money from the office.
But conflicting statements frustrate detectives.
It was completely a misdirection, a diversion.
How could somebody do this and get away with it?
Until the investigation takes a jaw-dropping turn.
The polygraph operator said he was lying.
It caught me by surprise. I remember him all of a sudden blowing up.
It was the turning point in the investigation.
Police investigating the fatal stabbing of 25-year-old restaurant manager Terry Brooks have learned that a disgruntled coworker lashed out at Terry before he was fired.
If you threaten somebody and they end up dead, you'd have to look at them and look at them seriously.
Steve Daly was a former Marine and had a difficult personality. He didn't like to be told what to do.
Just weeks before the murder, Terry and Steve had a major blowout.
There was an occasion at work where Steve Daly was told to make a hamburger for a customer, and he had just closed out that workspace, so he didn't want to reopen the workspace.
And I remember him all of a sudden blowing up. Steve lost his temper, was screaming and yelling.
He became explosive, at one point even calling Terry a bitch. Terry was alarmed by Daly's behavior.
Terry, in a situation like what happened with Steve, she wouldn't tolerate it.
She didn't waver. So I think that was the frustrating thing for Steve, is he couldn't break her.
And she was like, you need to go home, you are done for the night, and you will talk to the boss the next morning.
Daly storms out of the restaurant, and the next day Terry talks to her manager, tells him what had happened, which of course led to Daly being fired.
That did little to stop Steve's aggressive behavior.
Even after he was fired, Daly would return to the restaurant and buy food and have meals there.
He went back just to annoy her, just, here I am, you can't throw me out now. It was very upsetting to her.
So given his personality and his conduct, that certainly seems to provide a motive.
Did Steve Daly's harassment escalate into a fatal act of revenge? Police bring him in for an interview.
When we tracked Daly down, one of the first things he tells us that he knew at some point the police would be coming to talk to him. Daly said that he didn't get along with Terry, that they clashed often. In fact, he said that if she'd been a man, he would have punched her. Daly's excuse for why he was going back to the restaurant was that he was dating somebody who worked there. I don't know that I buy that, but that's the reason he gave.
Investigators ask where Steve was the night of the murder.
He says that he was trying to get into a club and that he was not permitted access to the club. So then he just drove around for several hours. Investigators go to the club, they look at the security footage. They can't find any footage of Daly being denied entry. So this is not a hard alibi that can allow you to say, okay, this person's eliminated. Just the opposite.
With no way to prove his whereabouts when Terry was killed, police ask Steve to take a polygraph.
So a polygraph is a useful investigative tool. It can help us rule people in or out. So Daly agrees to take the polygraph, and without question, he passed. This guy looks like a good suspect. So when you have momentum build like that and then it crashes to a halt, it's hard to swallow.
Police can't verify Steve's alibi, but with no evidence against him, he's free to go.
Stephen Daly was pushed down lower on the list of suspects, but you never eliminate somebody until you make sure that they are completely not involved.
Investigators turn their focus on the Roy Rogers staff who worked with Terry the night of the murder.
During the investigation, we knew that we had to interview the employees to see what the atmosphere was when they left, if there was any arguments. Everybody consented to have their fingerprints taken.
The evening that Terry was murdered, there were 4 employees that she was working with: Patricia, Ron, Barb, and Dan. And each of those employees was identified and interviewed separately.
Patricia tells investigators that just before closing, Terry discovered that money had gone missing from Barb's cash register.
The employees got in an argument, and there was $40 that was supposedly missing.
Terry was going to get to the bottom of this. It wasn't a minor event. She took it very seriously. She began questioning different employees. You know, where did it go? Why is it missing?
Terry played everything by the book. if there's any money missing and you are caught being the person that's been hitting the till. There's no tolerance for stealing.
Terry cared about her employees, but some people didn't like her because she could be tough when she needed to be tough.
Patricia indicated that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. If you're stealing money from Roy Rogers and you're an employee there, that's a fireable offense. So did this provide a motive for murder?
As Terry attempted to unmask the thief, the employees began to point fingers.
Barb told Terry that she thought Ron did it. So he's now being confronted with the idea that he took this money, and he actually turned his pockets inside out to prove, hey, he didn't have any cash on him.
Could Ron have killed Terry in a rage after being accused of stealing? As detectives look closer at Ron, fingerprint analysis provides crucial new evidence.
The employees who worked that night clean up before they close.
Working the later shift, you had to clean up everything, wash all the equipment, sweep them out the floors, wipe down all the tables, stuff like that.
So I thought that whoever was in there after closing could have possibly left fingerprints.
We began matching up fingerprints that they'd lifted from different services to elimination prints taken from different employees. And it was discovered that Ron's fingerprints were found on the drive-through window and on the trash bag that was wrapped around Terry's face. Here we go. This is somebody that we need to look at.
Investigators working to solve the Terry Brooks homicide have just got a match for fingerprints left at the crime scene.
The evening that Terry was murdered, there were 4 employees that she was working with, including an employee named Ron. And Ron's fingerprints were found on the drive-through window and on the trash bag that was wrapped around Terry's face.
Detectives ask Ron how his fingerprints ended up on the bag used to suffocate Terry and on the drive-through window, the killer's likely escape route.
Ron said that one of his responsibilities at the restaurant was to take care of the trash. So his fingerprints would have been on that bag because that was part of his job there. Ron also said that he'd covered for some other employees for their break time at the drive-thru, so that's why his print was there in the window.
Police aren't able to determine if the window had been properly cleaned at closing, so Ron's excuse is plausible. Still, detectives want to know his whereabouts after he left work.
Ron said that he left the restaurant shortly after 1 in the morning with coworkers, and that he got home about 1:15 and talked to his mom before he went to bed. We checked out Ron's alibi, discovered that he had indeed gotten home and stayed home all night.
With Ron all but cleared, police get new details from another employee about the money that had gone missing from Barb's cash register.
We learned the $40 that was supposedly missing, it was found at a later time.
The missing money had mysteriously reappeared in the drop safe.
I think it's fair to say that Terry might have thought that it was Barb who had taken this money. My impression was that Terry was suspicious of Barb.
Police also learned that it was Barb's duty to close down the drive-thru.
Those two things combined, the missing $40 and the fact that it was Barb's responsibility to lock that drive-thru window, and that ultimately it's found unlocked, and it's believed to be where the killer left, puts her at the top of the suspect list.
According to the work schedule, Barb and Terry were the last 2 employees at the restaurant.
The policy of Roy Rogers for employees that were going to work past the end of their shift was that they would lock the doors and that there would be a minimum of 2 employees there.
Could an argument between Terry and Barb over the missing money have turned deadly?
Barb said that she was sent home early by Terry, and she was insistent that she close the window and place the pipe in the track to lock. And in looking into Barb's whereabouts, we discovered that she was picked up by her boyfriend, so she had an alibi. So it's conceivable that Terry was alone in the restaurant, working into the early hours of February 4th doing inventory.
Police later confirmed the alibis of every employee who worked the night of the murder. When the autopsy report arrives, investigators hope it will give them a new lead.
The pathologist found that Terry had been strangled, and the bone in the back of her neck was severed from the stab wound.
There was a serious brain hemorrhage that was the result of her head being repeatedly banged against that hard concrete floor. And looking at that stab wound to her spine, it was likely she was conscious but paralyzed when the plastic trash bag was wrapped around her head.
The autopsy report lists each of Terry's severe injuries as potentially fatal, but indicates asphyxiation as the likely cause of death.
There was no indication that Terry had been sexually assaulted. You can't help but look at the way that Terry was killed and not think that the person who did this had such a high level of rage that they absolutely wanted to guarantee that she was dead. Material was collected from the knife that was left lodged in Terry's throat and under Terry's right ring finger, where the pathologist had identified a defensive wound. At the time of this murder in 1984, there was no DNA technology. Analysis of blood was really relegated to blood typing. By today's standards, the evidence was limited.
As the investigation continues, Terry's loved ones struggle to make sense of her violent death.
The funeral home called the morning of the viewing, and they said, you know, could somebody come down and take a look at Terry? And they had her laid out in the casket, and she didn't look good. You could see the cut marks in her neck, and you could see the bruises on the, you know, the back of her hand, and they had makeup on her too, and you could still see it didn't look like Terry. You know, I said when I got home to my dad, I think we should keep the casket closed. We didn't want people to remember her looking like that.
As the Brooks family prepares to bury their eldest daughter, Falls Township lives in fear of a brutal killer still at large.
It was a young person that was killed, you know, at her job. So I think the community as a whole regarded this as a frightening homicide.
It caused quite a bit of fear due to the fact that it was so violent, and most people in this area would think this shouldn't happen in our town.
I really thought it probably was, you know, a robbery. Unfortunately, they killed her instead of just robbing the place. But you don't know if somebody's lurking out there, you know, and they're going to do it again.
Less than 2 weeks after Terry's murder, the town's worst fear appears to become a horrifying reality.
At another Roy Rogers, an assistant manager was attacked coming out of the bathroom. She was hit in the head. She fell to the floor, and the actor ran away before she can identify him.
The restaurant manager survives. But just a week later in nearby Scranton, there's another brutal attack.
A male attacker waited in the parking lot until there was a lone female employee, then made entry into the restaurant. But the money from the restaurant had already been dropped into the safe, so he took the female employee's money and then stabbed her to death.
Detectives fear they have a serial killer on the loose.
And when you take a community that was already stressed, it made it even worse. And if you've got an individual who's going from restaurant to restaurant and just robbing people, and they have no personal connection to the victim, it's terrifying. It took it up a notch.
Three weeks after the murder of Terry Brooks, police have learned another restaurant employee has been stabbed to death in nearby Scranton.
Scranton's just up the turnpike, and it's not really that far from us. So anything that would indicate a violent armed robbery, we would have to look into.
It was such a similar homicide, a lone female employee inside a restaurant, a male attacker, and the use of a knife.
Investigators learn that a suspect has already been arrested. Could he also be Terry Brooks's killer?
The person that committed this homicide in Scranton was a man named Steve Duffy. We sent investigators to go to Scranton to attempt to interview Duffy, and by the time we arrive, he has lawyered up. But we got a warrant to obtain his fingerprints and compare them to the fingerprints from the scene. But in the end, a fingerprint comparison indicated no connection to the homicide at our Roy Rogers.
Police are also unable to identify a suspect in the assault of the manager at the other Roy Rogers location.
You go through this cycle of building momentum, and then you hit a wall. It's disheartening.
It's been a month since Terry Brooks was found dead, and the killer is still at large.
Something that brutal and that terrifying, you have to try to solve it, no matter how long it takes. But when the leads start running out, you get awful upset.
As weeks turned to months, and you identify suspects and then eliminate them over and over again. The case went cold. An investigator, by necessity, has to move on to other cases. But for a family that loses a loved one to a homicide, they don't move on.
When it first happened, you just assumed that it was going to be solved. You think, well, how could somebody do this and get away with it? My dad's hair turned white within a year. He lost weight. It just destroyed him.
It was hard for Terry's family, having to process the heartache of losing their daughter and not having closure over it. I couldn't imagine not having answers.
There are no significant developments in the investigation for nearly 14 years. Then, in 1998, Falls Township's new police chief orders a fresh look at the Terry Brooks murder, and a local prosecutor is assigned to the case.
One of the primary reasons that the police chief put this renewed focus on this case was that there had been developments in DNA technology during the 1990s. And part of the point of my assignment, to have someone come in with a fresh point of view, it was just a matter of reviewing all of those reports and reviewing all the physical evidence. It caught me by surprise a bit when I opened up the bag that contained Terry's wallet. I found that you could still clearly smell Terry's perfume. And because I wasn't expecting it, it's one of those things that sort of triggers your emotions and brings you closer to the victim.
A team is assembled for the renewed investigation.
Lori said, take a look at this homicide. And she asked me what I thought, and apparently my answers were well enough to get me assigned to work on it.
At the time that the homicide occurred, other robberies at fast food restaurants in the area caused law enforcement to form the initial theory that it was likely to have been a robbery.
We had the advantage of knowing that the robbery-homicide track didn't work out, so we could start with a different theory. There were two things that really jumped out. One, that we could conduct victimology interviews and talk to some people who weren't interviewed back at the time. And two, develop some kind of forensic signature for the killer.
As the lab works to extract the killer's DNA from crime scene evidence, investigators learn more about the victim, Terry Brooks.
Victimology essentially means learning everything you possibly can about the victim. Everybody who we spoke to described Terry Brooks as intelligent, ambitious, friendly, well-loved by her family and friends. Detective Whitney spent a lot of time with the family to gain their trust and to reassure them that we were working on the case diligently.
Nelson and Lori did seem like the power couple. Both of them are extremely intelligent, and they were driven to get this solved.
Detectives hope new interviews will bring to light crucial details that could help the case.
You just never know when you're going to get some new piece of information that's going to put us on a track to identify who did this.
Some of the people who we spoke to, they were quite young when this homicide occurred, in their late teens or early 20s. And having more life experience, were a bit more open than they might have felt they could be in the 1980s.
Detectives reach out to people who weren't interviewed in the 1984 investigation, including those who worked with Terry before her employment at Roy Rogers.
I got a call from Falls Township Police. They wanted to speak to me about the Terry Brooks murder, and they just said to me, "We'd like to hear your thoughts on it."
Cindy knew Terry well. They worked together, and Cindy kind of laid out what was going on in the victim's life.
During her interview with investigators, Cindy drops a bombshell.
What Cindy told us presented a completely different image of this homicide. It turned out Terry's murder wasn't what it appeared to be. And now you couldn't help but conclude everything's pointing to one person.
14 years after the murder of Terry Brooks, cold case investigators have just received shocking new information from a friend and former coworker of Terry's.
We asked what things did Terry share with, Cindy as a friend.
And I said to them, Terry and her fiancé Scott, their upcoming wedding at first was exciting for Terry. But I proceeded to tell them that the week before Terry had been murdered, she wanted to call off the wedding. She just realized that's not what she wanted.
We knew Terry and Scott had just put down a deposit on their honeymoon, and their wedding was upcoming. And in the initial investigation, the officers that conducted it came away with the impression that they were a happy couple.
There hadn't really been anything in the report that indicated there were any problems in Terry Brooks's relationship with Scott Keefe. But we did learn that Terry confided to some of her friends that she wasn't entirely sure she was going to go through with getting married.
Mr. and Mrs. Brooks felt close to Scott. He was the young man that was going to marry their daughter. To her parents, Scott was this loving, caring fiancé who would check on Terry and drive by to make sure she was, safe and give her rides.
Some of Terry's friends had a very different impression of Scott.
Cindy Bradney told us that there had been some problems in the relationship. For me, that was a red flag.
I think through time and her changing jobs and the fact that she was moving on and going for her dream and he was stuck where he was, his jealousy became an issue and he was very possessive. Scott would not let Terry stay alone. She was afraid to tell him she didn't want to be married. She was afraid to call it off. She didn't know what she was going to do, to the point where she was in tears.
Police get further insight into Terry and Scott's relationship from Terry's siblings.
When she started dating Scott, we just were all scratching our heads, like, what is she doing with him? He was just not the kind of guy she always dated. He wasn't fun-loving. All he wanted to do was sit there and drink. And that was just unlike her. Just seemed like he wanted to keep us away from her and him. It just makes you think back, like maybe he did have signs of an abusive person. But at the time, I just really thought it was a robbery, and she was killed during the robbery.
Detectives have a new perspective on Scott and how the supposedly grieving fiancé might have avoided suspicion at the time of Terry's death.
My dad thought Scott really loved Terry. He thought if she loved him, I'll love him too.
Mr. Brooks was a very kind man, and in fact, George bought Scott the suit that he wore to Terry's funeral.
Her father just had such a big heart that I don't think he believed that someone that his daughter fell in love with could harm her. And I believe Scott played on that.
Scott becomes someone that we think may have done this. Examining the crime scene through the lens of, what if Scott did this? Okay, that's how he got in. She let him in. We were told that he had a practice of going to the restaurant and sitting with her while she worked after hours. And it's personal, it's rage, and then the action of placing that bag over her face to kind of depersonalize her is a telltale mark of what someone does when they've killed somebody that they're close to. And now it becomes a priority for us to see if the forensic track, if the evidence points that way.
Investigators hope the killer's DNA can be extracted from the crime scene evidence collected back in 1984.
It was a potential concern that they might not be able to find any usable DNA due to the amount of time that had gone by.
Luckily, the knife that was left lodged in Terry's throat and the material collected from under Terry's right ring finger, where the pathologist had identified a defensive wound to that area, yielded an unknown male DNA profile.
It was highly unlikely under the circumstances that that DNA material would have come from anyone other than the perpetrator. The next thing we had to do was obtain a DNA sample from our suspect. Scott Keefe did not have a criminal record at that time. He didn't have any DNA samples on file with an agency such as the FBI. One of the things that we learned from the laboratory expert was that cigarette butts are an excellent potential source of DNA because they have saliva on them. And at that point, we actually knew what kind of cigarettes Keefe smoked, and we knew where he lived.
Police hatch a plan to secretly obtain a sample of Scott Keefe's DNA.
We didn't, at that point, want to obtain a subpoena to obtain DNA from him directly because we wanted to interview him first. We wanted to set that up in the most advantageous possible way, and we were concerned that he was a flight risk.
It was very important to us to be very careful about who knew he was a suspect and who we shared that information with. And it was also very important to us to not be caught doing surveillance. In 1998, Scott's life had kind of come full circle from where it was in 1984. In 1984, he was living at home with his parents. He had gone on to live with a girlfriend and then marry. They'd had a child together, but then they split up and got divorced. And in 1998, he was back home living with his mom.
Under Pennsylvania law, trash was considered to be abandoned property once it was put out in front of the house for collection. So Detective Whitney immediately took custody of it, took it directly to the laboratory that was doing the DNA analysis.
I knew I was going to get a definitive answer one way or the other. Could be him, could be somebody else. It was that anticipation of I'm going to get a final result here that's going to matter a great deal in this investigation.
Police investigating the 1984 murder of Terry Brooks have secretly collected a DNA sample from her fiancé, Scott Keefe.
We had to obtain a DNA sample from our suspect, so we collected cigarette butts that were in the trash.
The sample is compared to DNA found on Terry's body.
I'll never forget the phone call I got where the doctor at the lab informed me that there was a match from Scott's cigarettes to the crime scene evidence.
It was the turning point in the investigation. That was the point at which we knew we would be able to prove that Scott Keefe was the killer. Although we had very solid physical evidence against Keefe, it's always better if you have an incriminating statement from the defendant. We asked Mr. Keefe to come to the police station as one of the friends and family members that we were interviewing as part of our investigation.
We believed that he would cooperate with us. We believed that he would come across as wanting to help, that he would try to sell us the same story that he was the grieving fiancé, that he'd been telling people for 15 years.
As predicted, Scott agrees to cooperate with police.
We had a strategy to conduct that interview on the anniversary date of the murder. People pay attention to dates. It could raise a person's anxiety level and make them more apt to make mistakes.
The interview begins, and Scott tells a familiar tale.
He told us the same story that he had told others over the years, that they were happy, this was the love of his life, and that somebody else had taken her away from him. If we came on too hard, we were too aggressive in our questioning, we felt he would lawyer up and stop the interview. So slowly we built towards the question of whether Scott had anything to do with this or any knowledge of it. And once we got to that point, we asked Scott if he would take a polygraph.
You can never force anyone to undergo a polygraph examination, but he agreed to that.
The polygraph operator said he was lying. So now Scott started to say things like, I didn't mean for this to happen. But then he caught himself and said, but I didn't do it. But over time, that culminated at one point in him saying, she came at me first. And that was the first time he put himself at the scene.
Investigators keep the pressure on. And finally, Scott breaks.
He admitted that she essentially told him that she wanted to break up with him, and he was enraged because of that.
At one point, he punched her in the face. They struggled for a while in that kitchen prep area. A knife had fallen onto the floor, and he knocked her down and straddled her, choking her and banging her head repeatedly against the floor. But then he grabbed the knife and stabbed her with it, and it stuck in her throat. Then, in his words, he bent over to make sure she was dead, saw that she was still breathing, so he grabbed the trash can liner to wrap around her face to make sure that she would in fact die, and he said he didn't want to look at her face.
At that point, he admitted he took the money from the office.
He said he exited to the drive-through window to make it look like a robbery. Scott told us that the reason he went to the Brooks family home the morning of the murder was to make him look innocent. So he's surrounded by her family when the crime is supposedly discovered. It was completely a misdirection, a diversion that worked for 15 years for him.
Scott is charged with first-degree murder.
I was elated. I was like, thank God they finally nailed him. Because we waited a long time. Getting the answers of who killed my sister really gave my dad some comfort. But I think he was still in disbelief that Scott did it.
We were just so happy we could tell her family that the person who had killed their daughter was in prison, and we were confident he was going to be convicted.
At trial, Scott Keefe is found guilty and sentenced to life in prison.
Terry was a tremendous young person who had unlimited potential. She had good relationships with her family. It's really a terrible tragedy that her life ended this way.
It's just so sad that somebody so young, because of standing up for themselves and wanting to move forward in their lives, gets their life cut short.
Terry would have had a very bright future, and I'm sure she would have had a ton of kids, and we'd be hanging out right now.
Terry would love to be remembered with those big eyes, that smile, her kindness in her heart, and a person with a goal. She was truly a lovely, lovely person.
It was a horrific attack on an elderly woman.
She had been struck at least 30 blows to her head and face.
She had fractures to her skull, cheekbone was broken. It's at times hard to fathom how another human could do that to another human.
Attacked in her own home and killed. The town was shocked.
He was deemed to be the most dangerous man in Britain. He was on the run and he was desperate.
The #1 priority was to locate him and catch him as quick as we could. He was a real risk to the public.
Nestled in the rolling hills of Northumberland lies the picturesque town of Hexham.
Hexham is a good place to be. It's a very established community, lots going on here. It's welcoming.
You walk up the streets, everybody speaks, everybody knows you. Just a lovely town.
Hexham has a very close-knit community. It's exactly what you'd expect in a rural area.
It's also got a lot of farmland around it, a really good quality of life. It's regularly voted as one of the best places in the country to live.
It's quite affluent. It's a thriving market town with pubs, shops, everything you'd expect to find in a rural part of Northumberland.
It's got a beautiful cobbled market square, beautiful abbey, very quiet, low crime rate, not a great deal happens there.
But the peace in pretty Hexham is about to be shattered.
We received a call from a member of the public in Newcastle city centre, which was probably 30 miles from Hexham. The member of the public had been walking through one of the streets in the centre of Newcastle and had found a handbag on the top of a public bin on the side of a pavement.
They saw the bag and thought it was a bit odd because I think it was in quite good condition, and they took it and handed it into the police as lost property.
It was apparent there were no valuables there, so the suspicion was it had been taken with the intention of taking whatever was in it.
The police searched the handbag to see if they could identify who it belonged to, and inside they found some ID.
The ID was in the name of 77-year-old Hexham pensioner Judith Richardson.
Officers were dealing with what they thought was just a lost bag.
The police in Newcastle got in touch with the police in Hexham, and the police in Hexham went around to the home of Miss Richardson to explain to her that her property had been found.
When the officers got to Hexham and called at Judith's address, they were expecting to find someone who would answer the call and probably say that the bag had been stolen.
But when police knock, there's no answer. With concerns about Judith's age, they decide to gain entry.
When they got in, they found Judith dead in the hallway of her flat.
It was clear from the injuries sustained, which were horrific, that, someone had done this. It was clear that it was a homicide because of the level of injury.
She had been struck at least 30 blows to her head and face.
And that's when they began a murder investigation.
I was head of the CID for Northumbria Police at that time. The senior investigating officer that was conducting the investigation at that point came to see me and briefed me about the occurrence. This was a completely random attack. We were simply presented with a body in the passageway of a house. We didn't have any idea at that time who the offender was.
Officers piece together what they can about who Judith was.
She lived on her own in a small flat in a very nice part of Hexham. She was just a normal person living in the community and going about her daily business.
She had a very, very simple life. She didn't have any close family in the sense of children. She was a spinster and lived by herself with a dog. She was well known to the local church where she attended regularly. She was a real pillar of the community.
With nothing untowards in Judith's life, investigators turn to the scene of the crime.
The first things to do are to secure the scenes, and the scene at the address is the first scene where the body is, but obviously there's the corresponding scene in Newcastle city centre, which is the handbag and the bin. So we've got to take control of those scenes to then enable us to conduct inquiries in the right way, so we don't lose evidence.
There's no evidence of a break-in, but it's clear drawers and cupboards have been ransacked, so forensic officers focus on items of interest to see if they hold clues.
On the floor of the hallway of Miss Richardson's home, when her body was discovered, was an Age UK leaflet. Fingerprint was discovered on it. A tissue was found that was stained with blood and found within the bedroom of Miss Richardson's home.
While the tissue and the leaflet are sent to the lab for tests, Judith's body is carefully removed and examined by a pathologist.
I was the crime scene photographer in the post-mortem. Judith was a 77-year-old woman. Reminded me of my grandma a little bit, and the attack was so severe it is at times hard to fathom how another human could do that to another human. There were a lot of injuries to photograph. She had fractures to her skull, cheekbone was broken, There were lacerations and bruising to the brain, and she had a lot of bruising all over her body. And Judith had a number of kind of cuts and defensive wounds as well on her hands and fingers. It was really clear that the cause of death was from blunt force trauma. And there was some speculation at that time that it could have been caused by something like a hammer. I think everybody was quite shocked just at how brutal and savage this attack was.
Something like this would, and indeed did, send shockwaves through the entire community. It's totally unexpected. The ferocity of the attack was absolutely exceptional, and particularly to happen in a place like Hexham.
Couldn't believe that a little old woman would be attacked in this town, you know, just didn't know who was loose about. Oh, it's terrible. The town was shocked.
Investigators turn their attention to the place where Judith's bag was found, in the hope they can discover who may have dumped it there.
The senior investigating officer at the time made a really good call early on to obviously focus on the bin and the surrounding area, and in particular the CCTV that covered that part of the city, and try and lock down any CCTV, particularly in Newcastle city centre, that may overlook the bin in question. But it was really important that detectives were sent to secure any cameras from shops, business premises, from public CCTV on lampposts or whatever, to ensure that none of the evidence or potential evidence was lost. And then it was a case of trawling through to ascertain who put the bag on top of the bin. A little squad of officers were put onto the reviewing of the CCTV. One of the officers started by focusing on the bin at around the time that the member of the public had called it in. So working backwards from that time, there was only one camera, I understand, covering that bin, and it was a long distance shot with a very poorly pixelated image that showed the bin.
Something piques the detective's interest.
Looked like a bus had pulled up near to the bin. A number of people had gotten off the bus. Could that have been the time when the bag was discarded at the bin? That grainy image then necessitated a contact with the bus company, who could only provide, you know, a rough outline of lots of buses. You know, we didn't have one particular bus at a particular time on a particular street. So we were presented with, you know, quite a volume of CCTV, which has to be manually viewed. And it's a real arduous task. It's time-consuming, it's difficult, it's painstaking, but that's the basis of what good detective work is.
But the hard graft soon pays off.
On one of the buses, there was an image from the cab of the driver which saw a man get off at Clayton Street at the relevant point. And actually, as he gets off the bus, his arm moves to the left and he places what we now know to be the bag on top of the bin. The number one priority was to locate him and catch him as quick as we could.
In Hexham, Northumberland, 77-year-old Judith Richardson has been found bludgeoned to death in her own home. CCTV has been uncovered showing a man getting off a bus in Newcastle and placing Judith's handbag on a bin. Police need to retrace their suspect's steps to track him down urgently.
There were hundreds and hundreds of hours of CCTV which they had to check in order to track down this footage, which was of him on the bus.
So from that we got a description. The officers then went back in time and looked at the same CCTV from other cameras on the bus, and there in clear view, up the centre of the bus, sat in the middle, was the offender.
They had CCTV of him sitting on the back of the bus with the bag on his lap, which was absolutely crucial.
Not hiding it, in open display, and it was on camera. So that gave us the clue that he's probably the man that's committed this crime. From there was a huge amount of work went on. One, backtracking on the bus to see where he'd come from, but two, to follow through where had he gone after depositing the bag. Now that necessitated several cameras in the city centre to be cross-referenced and cross-checked, but we had a description from the clear imagery off the bus of this individual wearing a green shirt. And it was on different cameras on a different street that this individual was spotted going into a jeweller's shop. When officers then went to the shop, there was CCTV inside the jewellers, and there's the offender pawning or selling what turned out to be Judith's jewellery. Once it was identified that he'd been into this particular jeweller's, officers were deployed to go and conduct inquiries. They spoke to the owner of the store, who provided a ledger where he'd signed a name. G. Jarman. I think it's fair to say that when officers recovered the ledger and the signature in the name of G. Jarman, they didn't for 1 minute think that that would be the actual name of the person in question. I think everybody thought it would be a made-up name, but unbelievably, it wasn't. And G. Jarman became the focus of our attention at that time. The SIO conducted immediate inquiries on the police national computer and identified that he was a missing sex offender from the Durham area. He'd been arrested for a shoplifting offence a few days before the murder and bailed to court, but had not appeared at court. So that was an immediate trigger for Durham to then raise the alarm and concern about this individual, who was now known as Graham Jarman.
Investigators are shocked when they uncover Jarman's criminal history.
He was a very, very dangerous individual. Obviously, Durham Constabulary, which is the force next down south from Northumbria, they had been managing him as a sex offender. So an officer, a risk management officer, would have been regularly visiting Jarman. They were going to be the font of knowledge around who this person was, his background, his hobbies, his habits, his lifestyle. And that individual provided us with significant information to paint this very detailed picture of who we were actually dealing with. An incredibly dangerous man.
He was previously identified as the most dangerous man in Britain in the early 90s. He was guilty of the most horrendous sex crime, where he kidnapped a 17-year-old, put her in the back of a car, used a horrendous expression, "I'm your everyday psycho." He was also involved in a series of armed robberies, so he had a criminal career which dated right back to his early 20s, really. Bearing in mind he was in his 40s and even had spent most of his adult life in prison.
His previous convictions were horrendous. There was rape, kidnap. He'd been to prison several times for long stretches of jail time. I think 15 years was one of them, 8 years was another. To say that he was a dangerous individual was an understatement.
But as detectives discover, Jarman hadn't always followed a life of crime.
People who knew him from the 80s think that he seems to be a very different person from the one that they knew then to who became this really aggressive, violent man committing a lot of crime.
Graham Jarman had worked as a civil servant, as I recall it, and then something had plainly happened that triggered him into a world of not just criminality, but criminality of the most serious type. And I don't know, certainly for certain, what that thing was that happened in his life, although, like everyone I've seen, it reported that he had a particularly significant reaction to discovering that he was adopted.
This is when it's believed Jarman's life started to spiral out of control.
He used betting shops a lot, as far as I'm aware. He's had gambling problems.
He had a compulsion to violence and sexual offending and robbery because of his gambling addiction, and was prepared to do anything, and then just seemed to, you know, suffer the consequences, really.
He was a loner, he had no friends, he was quite articulate. He enjoyed reading broadsheet newspapers, but he was a horrible, nasty individual.
But police need to link Jarman with the place where Judith was killed, Hexham.
The guys then worked on the CCTV off the buses and were able to backtrack him to Prudder, which is another little area in Northumberland, and then from there he actually got off a bus from Hexham in Prudder, went into a shop, and then got onto this bus and into Newcastle. So it was in effect backtracking back into Hexham, which is what they were able to do.
To track Jarman's movements in Hexham, investigators speak to businesses with CCTV. Chris Dunlop's pub is on the main thoroughfare into the town centre.
Police came in, asked if they could use the cameras to have a look if anyone had walked past, because we have a camera on one side of the building, a camera on the other side of the building. And it was just by chance that he'd walked past this camera and he was on this camera, and they just thought he was a strange man, so they followed him. There's the camera there that caught him walking past on the road.
What we've been able to pull together from the compilation of the CCTV is that Jarman had indeed come to Hexham on the 17th. He'd stayed overnight in a guest house on the first night. On the second night, he apparently had slept rough somewhere in Hexham. And on the day of the murder, the Friday the 19th, he'd been seen walking up and down various locations in the centre of Hexham.
I think that the CCTV put him in Hexham, observing elderly women. From what's known now, potentially looking for victims, for targets. And I know that there was CCTV of him leaving a hardware store in Hexham and Judith was entering.
Police now have a link between Jarman and the murder victim. But that's not all.
In the period before the killing of Miss Richardson, he was caught on CCTV walking towards her home. And in the period after her killing, he was captured by the same camera walking away from her home.
Round about the same time that we received an update from the forensic services saying that we received a forensic hit on a fingerprint that had been found on an Age UK form that had been left in Judith's house. And that fingerprint also matched the name Graham Jarman.
Also, his DNA was found on a tissue that was blood-stained within the bedroom at her home where she had been attacked.
In the meantime, there's been another big development.
A hammer was found in a Aldi plastic carrier bag. It was found on the wall of one of the neighbours.
The hammer was examined and DNA was discovered on it.
Blood and hair found on the head of the hammer matches the DNA profile of none other than Judith Richardson. But Graham Jarman's whereabouts are unknown.
Once we come to terms with the fact that we've got a really serious offender with a background that is just unbelievably violent and aggressive, and whose mental state is such that, you know, he's been described as a psychopath, it's absolutely imperative to get a hold of the individual. So we had to try and track him down. To protect the public, he had to be captured very, very quickly.
In Hexham, Northumberland, 47-year-old Graham Jarman is wanted in connection with the robbery and murder of pensioner Judith Richardson. After finding his fingerprint and DNA at the crime scene, police need to track him down urgently. Jarman's mother tells detectives he hasn't been seen at their home in Consett, County Durham, for weeks.
I know that he lived with his mother at the time of the murder. It was quite a curious relationship in the sense that she gave him money to spend.
His mother controlled him to a great degree and stopped him from, presumably, to stop him gambling everything away. But it also became apparent that she'd left in the weeks preceding to go and visit family.
So his source of income had been lost. He'd spent his allowance because of his gambling habits.
And Jarman had actually stolen from his own mother. He'd taken a DVD player and sold it, and then when he realised the mother was coming back, that was his switch to say, time for me to leave. And that's when he started the offending.
Investigators launch a manhunt. They need to retrace their suspect's steps after he pawned Judith's jewellery in Newcastle.
He was followed on CCTV, getting into a taxi which we believe went to Gosforth, which is an area at the north of Newcastle, and his whereabouts thereafter were unknown. He would jump on buses and travel all over the area, but his background and his previous offending meant that this was really #1 priority for primarily North East forces. The first priority really was to come up with a press strategy, which then meant speaking to the media, getting the message out, identifying who he was with photographs and imagery that we had to get the public to be the eyes and ears for the police.
Journalists and reporters from all over the North East are enlisted to help.
We were called in for a briefing by Northumbria Police in order to explain the background to the case, the fact that he was on the run, the fact that they needed the public to try and keep an eye out for him in very simple terms, release a picture of him and appeal for assistance in tracking him down. He was deemed to be the most dangerous man in Britain, yet again having previously been identified as the most dangerous man in Britain in the early 90s. And as soon as his name became public, we were aware of the really horrendous background of offending, which he was guilty of and had been found guilty of previously, so that you knew you had a very, very dangerous individual who was out at large.
To add to the investigators' woes, Jarman is already one step ahead.
He was seen in a supermarket where he changed his clothing, so he was changing his appearance to make it much harder to track and find him.
We do know that he'd purchased a set of hair trimmers and he'd shaved his head to try and change his appearance. He was almost bald, or looked, very closely shaven. The search was really about understanding him and trying to preempt where he was going to go. And what we thought was really important was to get the expert input from a forensic psychologist, which is what we did.
The reason they brought in a psychologist, although it sounds a bit like Cracker the TV series, was really to try and identify his motivations, his pattern of behaviour, what he was likely to do while he was on the run.
That psychologist came up to Durham and assisted with us, and we spent hours with that individual poring over who Graham Jarman was. He was able to paint this picture of the sort of mindset. He classed him as a psychopath plus.
The psychologist tried to identify what he might do next. He'd been living with his mum, so the chances were he was on the run and alone and was trying to fend for himself, really. Where would he get the money from? Could he potentially target another elderly victim?
The psychologist was then able to build and draw and come up with a really detailed offender profile of Jarman, which didn't only look at his history, but almost got into his head and his mindset of what he'd be thinking, what he'd be concerned about, what he'd be planning. And from that fed into our strategy for press releases to the public. When we were asking the public, rather than just saying, this guy's wanted, please tell us if you see him. We had to provide something more, and we were able to do that. The profile indicated that he was transient. He would travel on public transport, in particular buses. He would go into bookmakers to place his bets, if he had any money, that was. He liked going into libraries where he would sit and read. So this all had to be passed out to the public to try and get them to engage and be really vigilant.
Soon, a result. There's a sighting of Jarman in a betting shop some 50 miles south of Newcastle, in Saltburn. Then, 2 days later, he's found on CCTV entering a supermarket 20 miles west, in Yarm. For the manhunt team, this is a worrying trend.
As the days developed, we received sightings, information from other forces that suggested he was transient and moving. He'd gone as far south as Cleveland, and we had sightings in Stockton and other places in and around that area, which brought Cleveland police into the mix. So we now had the three northeast forces, Northumbria, Durham and Cleveland, one on top of the other, going south, and it was apparent that Jarman was on the move. And there was reason to believe he was potentially going to commit crime as he moved down. And there was a suggestion that he was potentially going right to the southern coast to see family and friends down there.
Forces in the southeast are also put on high alert.
And that's when it was press the red button, and it becomes a really multi-force chase. We even contacted Sussex police at one point to give them the heads up that he may be on the way down, so they could start and advertise the fact that this individual may just suddenly appear on their patch.
There was information put out that people and the public should not approach him. It was recognition that he was a violent man, he was quite a dangerous man. They had more police presence in libraries. They put more presence around kind of betting shops.
There were meeting after meeting, hours and hours of research went into tracking him down. But every time we got a sighting, we were always that one step behind it. By the time we got the notification and went and checked the CCTV and confirmed it was him, he'd obviously moved. So it was frustrating. And not all of the sightings were actually of Jarman, and that was another frustration, and it always is on a manhunt like this, where every single request has got to be assessed, visited and checked out. We had several sightings that were Jarman, others were not and had to be discounted.
The manhunt team makes one final push.
We took the decision to really ramp up the media engagement and appeals to the public. And I took the lead on that in terms of conducting a number of interviews.
I'm appealing directly to the public and indeed to Mr. Jarman to give himself up.
I think I did about 14 individual interviews with different media outlets, local news, TV, newspapers, radio stations, to push this message and really go for it in a big way to try and get that message loud and clear to the public.
We need to speak to him as a matter of urgency.
Days later, news comes in from Yorkshire.
A librarian in Filey in North Yorkshire had heard the press appeal, had gone into work on Saturday morning, and she'd put Jarman's face, that was released in the media, on her computer screen as a screensaver, and got on with her business. And she was walking around the library that particular morning when, lo and behold, there's an individual sat reading a newspaper in front of her, and she realised it was Jarman, the very person we were looking for.
Obviously aware of the fact that he was dangerous, but aware of the fact that this fugitive was in her midst, she did exactly the right thing, immediately got in touch with police, kept an eye on him to make sure he wasn't going anywhere, and not give away any kind of suspicion at all, which is obviously crucial in that context.
2 local bobbies turned up.
I was sat in Filey Library, just minding my own business, and I was just sat there, and then the police came in. I was wondering what was going on, and it turns out that they were after the man that was sat next to me on the computer. It was actually terrifying, to be honest.
He gave a cock and bull story about it not being him. They called in their more experienced sergeant, who took none of it.
And he just stood up and went quite quietly, to be fair. He didn't kick off, didn't do anything, he just got up and left.
They promptly arrested him on suspicion of murder. And a live scan fingerprint check quickly revealed that we had our man.
In Filey, North Yorkshire, Graham Jarman has been arrested on suspicion of the murder and robbery of Hexham pensioner Judith Richardson. The 2-week manhunt, covering hundreds of miles across the northeast, is finally over.
It was an absolute relief to hear that news. I was delighted that he'd been captured, and to hear that it was in a library was the icing on the cake in terms of where we presumed he would be. There was a lot of pressure on us as law enforcement agencies to actually get a hold of this individual. There was a massive threat and risk to the public. It would have been a real tragedy had anybody else been hurt or indeed killed. So I was absolutely delighted with the combined efforts of all the police involved in the various forces. But I've also got to say that was just half of the story. Catching him was one thing, but building a case against him was the real issue. Arrangements would have been made for Northumbria officers to go down to Filey, pick him up and transport him back to Northumbria, where obviously the SIO and his team progressed with interviews.
As I recall it, during the course of the extensive interviews that the police conducted with Graham Jarman, he did give an account of where he had been and what he said he had done.
And then, you know, proceeded to give the various excuses about why he had the bag and belongings of Judith.
His account of the handbag was that he had been walking along the road where Judith Richardson lived.
He claimed that he'd simply been outside of Judith's property and saw the handbag lying on the wall and had picked it up, claiming that the real killer must have left it. Obviously, that was complete nonsense.
In the meantime, investigators uncover more evidence of Jarman's crime spree.
It turns out that a couple of offences had been committed by him. On the way down, I think he was either in Whitby or Bridlington, he'd gone to the coast and observed a young fella parking his car up, getting a surfboard off the roof of his car, and then putting a wetsuit on and going into the sea. Jarman saw that as an opportunity to break into his car and stole, amongst other things, a wallet with the young guy's identification and credit cards and things. He then went into a shoe shop where a lone female store attendant was present, and he robbed her of money. And on leaving that store, he dropped an identity card which was actually stolen from the car that he'd attacked when the surf had gone into the sea, which again I think was used to try and bluff his way when the officers arrived to speak to him at the library in Filey.
After 3 days of intensive interviewing, detectives believe they have a compelling case against Graham Jarman.
His DNA police submit the scene. They had details of the journey to where the bag was dumped. They had CCTV of him dumping the bag. They had him on the bus with the bag. He gave his name when he went to the pawnbroker's note to sell Judith's valuables. The evidence against him was overwhelming.
The SIO and the team put the case to the CPS, and Jarman was charged with Judith's murder.
Paul Greene KC is appointed to represent Jarman in court.
I have a clear recollection of my first meeting with Graham Jarman. What struck me about him was that he was plainly an intelligent individual and a clear-thinking individual who had his own ideas about his own case. So he certainly didn't present to me as an everyday psychopath. If you hadn't known what he had done in the past and, you know, what he was accused of doing, you wouldn't have guessed. He was straightforward, and certainly I didn't find him at all a difficult person to deal with. But at all stages, Graham Jarman denied that he was responsible for the murder of Miss Richardson and made clear that he intended to have a trial.
Graham Jarman finally faces justice at Newcastle Crown Court. He pleads not guilty to the murder of Judith Richardson.
He sits in court and he doesn't give away anything when the evidence is being outlined, because the jury are there, and obviously be aware of the fact that the jury are watching him, so tend not to show any emotion for obvious reasons.
The prosecution outlines Jarman's motive.
He was a gambling addict. He didn't have much money to his name.
The assumption is that he was simply looking for a victim in order to try and get a source of money, really. Prior to the murder, he was seen in Hexham, clearly targeting elderly people, elderly women, in order to rob them, basically.
But the prosecution sets out how Jarman clearly has violence in mind.
The CCTV played an important part in tracking him, leaving Beals, it's called, where he'd actually stole the hammer from. And I believe that's where they think that he spotted Judith as a target.
After following Judith home, Jarman waits outside, then charms his way in, pretending to be from Age UK, and accidentally drops the leaflet in the hallway.
It was a truly shocking attack. He brutally assaulted her repeatedly with a hammer.
He'd gone and started ransacking her property, and then he beat her for a second time,
leaving her dead in the passageway of a house.
It's believed Jarman cleans himself up at the scene, dropping the bloodied tissue containing his DNA. And then leaves with Judith's stolen handbag.
And the prosecutor made quite clear to the jury that the level of violence he used was completely, you know, horrific, but also unnecessary given the context. He could have walked in, taken all the valuables and walked out. There was no need to take her life. Jarman didn't take the stand, and given the level of evidence against him, you can understand why that is the case.
We knew that we were facing a complex and difficult case. Graham Jarman was demonstrated to have been in possession of the handbag of Miss Richardson, and it was proved and indeed acknowledged by him that he had pawned some jewellery that belonged to her, getting £300 or about that for it, and even signing his own name for the receipt. Also, part of the case against him at trial was that he had changed his appearance in the period after the killing of Miss Richardson, to which his response was, "I'm a shoplifter and I regularly change my appearance so as to reduce the prospect of being detected for that crime."
The jury retires to consider its verdict.
The jury was in retirement for a number of days.
And eventually the jury decided he was guilty of the said offence.
The SI Owner's team had delivered excellent evidence. It was overwhelming.
It was inevitable that the judge would impose a very lengthy minimum term, which he did. A term of 35 years that Mr. Jarman will have to serve before he can apply for parole.
A very, very long sentence was given, and I don't think he'll ever be released. I don't think he'll ever deemed to be safe, even when he's an elderly man.
The brutality of Judith's killing still haunts her town of Hexham.
This was a targeted attack for financial gain. And the really sad part about that is that from what he got, he actually only got £300. So this brutal murder took place for £300.
I'm sure the people in Hexham would have had a really negative impact by this crime. It's very rare. certainly in a lovely area like the market town that is Hexham.
I do think that justice has been served for Judith, but I don't think that Graham should have actually been out in the community. He had a really long, violent history. Had he been in jail, then this crime may not have occurred, and I think that's the really sad part.
A gregarious young man, just months away from his wedding day.
He was always happy. All he wanted in life was to have a family, work hard, and fall in love.
Has his future viciously ripped away.
It was evident the young man had been bludgeoned.
It hurt me so much, and I lost it. I lost it. Me volví loca.
Investigators are sent down a rabbit hole of suspects.
He was violently jealous. He's a significant drug dealer. It looked like that he may have been kidnapped.
They were accompanying a very scared-looking Hispanic young man.
Before a shocking revelation.
What he was describing was more like something off of a TV show.
Turns the case on its head.
What he did to us changed our life forever.
It was a shock to all of us.
It came as an absolute surprise.
He had no remorse, he had no guilt. He's a monster.
Cornelius, a small town in northern Oregon, nestled among picturesque orchards.
Cornelius is a longtime farming community. It's a very kind of nice, sort of sleepy place.
It's kind of a little bedroom community. It's mostly a blue-collar town, working class.
The calm of Cornelius is shaken one quiet morning with the reported disappearance of 20-year-old Gonzalo Pizano Guzman.
That morning, my mom saw that Gonzalo's bed was made, like no one slept there. So she obviously got all concerned. He didn't come home last night. And then my mom tells me to go to the police station with Sol to report him missing.
His fiancée, Sol, and his sister, Juana, had been actively looking for him that day.
That morning, the family contacted his place of employment. He had not shown up for work.
The family was extremely distraught by this disappearance. He doesn't miss work without calling in. They couldn't reach him by pager or by telephone.
And we're all freaking out because this is not who he is and what he does. It's so odd, it's not normal.
We learned that Saul had seen Gonzalo the night before. They had visited with each other until about 9:15 that evening, and Saul reported seeing him leaving in his car alone, headed home.
But he did not return home last night.
To aid the detectives, Saul provides a description of what Gonzalo was wearing when she last saw him.
He had on an athletic top with some numbers on it, and specifically 2 gold chains.
While Juana and Saul speak with police, other family members frantically look for Gonzalo.
We all went different ways in our cars, driving around just to see if we found his car. We were trying to look for anything.
My dad thought, maybe he got in an accident. We were desperate. We just wanted a clue.
Around 4 or 5 o'clock in the afternoon, we all started feeling like, okay, something's wrong now.
On the outskirts of town, Gonzalo's father makes a disturbing discovery.
My dad spotted the car in an empty field. When he saw the car, the white car, he knew right away that was Gonzalo's car. He found the car burned up. He rushed to the car, opened up the car, and didn't find any body. So once that happened, it was just nuts. Where is he at? Did he get kidnapped? Is he dead? It was even worse.
Detectives arrive and search for signs of what happened to Gonzalo.
The car was totally destroyed by fire. It appeared that the car had been heavily doused with accelerant, probably gasoline.
Somebody was clearly trying to cover up evidence from inside that vehicle.
There was no evidence of any body.
There were zip ties found near the car.
As far as the scene was concerned, it yielded minimal clues. As the car had been burned completely, the chances of DNA or blood or fingerprints were greatly reduced.
Later that afternoon, another chilling discovery is made, just 11 miles away.
A citizen had seen something that looked like a dead body in the ditch on her road. The body was found about a 15-20 minute drive from where the burned car was.
This young man matched both the physical description, the clothing, and the jewelry. At this point, there was no doubt that this was Gonzalo. It was clearly a homicide. There was evidence of bullet wounds on the body and what appeared to be repeated knife blows to the heart. We also discovered some injuries to the back of the head, and it was evident the young man had been bludgeoned.
It was apparent that he died a violent death.
We felt almost immediately that this was very personal in nature. There was no phone and there was no wallet at the scene, but he still had his jewelry with him, which were gold. So the thought of this being a robbery was off the table pretty quickly. There was another motive here.
There were zip ties found near the body, and they matched the zip ties from the scene of the car. One of the things that went through my head was, had someone brought zip ties to restrain Gonzalo? We also located 4 spent casings from a .40 caliber semi-automatic pistol.
After finishing up at the crime scene, police are faced with the difficult task of delivering the devastating news to Gonzalo's family.
The police came early in the morning. I opened the door and they told me, "We found your brother, but unfortunately he's dead." I was in shock.
Grité. Me volví loca. Y yo gritaba. Y gritaba y gritaba.
I heard my mom screaming. It was something I never want to hear again. It's not even a scream. It's a pain so deep that only moms know what that is. I found out that he was murdered. And I lost it. I lost it. Era gritar, llorar. Algo tan fuerte que todavía de mi mente no se ha acabado. To know that such an amazing person was taken away, he didn't deserve to die that way. Bottom line is, I don't have my brother anymore.
Born in Mexico in 1979, Gonzalo had a playful spirit.
He loved to dance, he loved music, always a smile, always caring, and always joking around with people.
Gonzalo era un muchacho alegre y llegaba, me abrazaba y siempre quería bailar conmigo.
When the family moved to the United States in 1989, outgoing Gonzalo settled in quickly.
He was very charming, he was really good looking, he was popular with the girls, so he was always asked to be in quinceañeras, which is a traditional, party for us Mexicans when you turn 15.
In 1998, Gonzalo met Marisol Mora at a party, and the teenagers quickly fell in love.
De que estaba muy enamorado de Marisol. Marisol era el amor de su vida de Gonzalo. Era todo para él. Todo.
It was that genuine love and happiness. There was a light in him. He was a completely different person, a happy, full person. All he wanted in life was to have a family, work hard, and fall in love.
After a whirlwind romance, Gonzalo proposed to Marisol.
So the wedding was set to be in September. That was just a couple of months after he was murdered. We have a big family, so it was going to be a big deal.
But instead of a wedding, Gonzalo's loved ones are left heartbroken and grieving. While his family plans a funeral, detectives are digging into the work of this homicide case.
This case was puzzling. There really didn't seem to be a strong motive as to why this young man was murdered. Everything was going good in his life.
He was responsible. He wasn't involved in gangs.
He's just very well liked, very upbeat, and just a trustworthy young man.
It was really difficult. There were still so many unanswered questions, and we had no definitive leads as to who would have caused this or who we were looking for.
The fact that there was still a killer out there, to me, it was very ominous.
This is very grim. We needed to really look into who was responsible for this.
Coming up, investigators uncover a menacing grudge.
He held an extreme dislike for Gonzalo.
He was determined to have Gonzalo killed.
The knife wounds directed at the heart did speak of extreme animosity.
And leads them to discover a web of alarming secrets and lies.
She wasn't in love with Gonzalo, and he wasn't in love with her.
She admitted it was all a lie.
He saw skinheads in the vehicle.
And that's when we really started to think something was wrong.
Before the truth blindsides everyone.
I was like in shock. It was so senseless. It was so senseless.
In the town of Cornelius, Oregon, police are investigating the vicious murder of 20-year-old Gonzalo Pizano Guzman. Wanting more details about his last known movements, detectives speak to his fiancée, Saul.
She described in detail how Gonzalo had come to her house on the night of the 6th, that they sat out front on the porch.
They were discussing their plans for the upcoming wedding and going over a guest list. She stated that following the conversation that he left around 9 o'clock. She stated while they were sitting on the porch that her cousin Jaime and a friend Eddie were playing in the garage of the house, apparently shooting baskets.
That led us to believe that these two young fellows may have been the last known persons to see Gonzalo alive. So it was important that we interview them.
Investigators bring Jaime and Eddie into the sheriff's office.
During the interview, both stated that they had to get to work that night and approached Gonzalo as he was getting in his car and asked if they could get a ride.
They were running late for work. They worked on a janitorial crew run by Saul's brother, Raphael.
They had to be at work in Hillsboro at the Hawthorne Farms Fitness Center at 10 o'clock.
They said Raphael picked them up and took them to work at the athletic club, and that eventually they got off at about 4:30 in the morning.
The fact that they both gave the same statement actually provided themselves an alibi. They did not offer any conflict that they had with Gonzalo. They indicated that they had no reason to hurt him.
To corroborate Jaime and Eddie's alibi, police speak to their boss, Saul's brother, Raphael.
We interviewed him at his house. He was very cooperative, very smooth, very polite, had his own business, a young entrepreneur.
Raphael was an incredibly self-possessed 19-year-old. He had created a janitorial service.
Although he was very young, had a very good contract, had his own cleaning company, and appeared to be very successful.
Detectives ask him to confirm Jaime and Eddie's story.
He confirmed that he had picked them up at Eddie's house and drove them to work. He confirmed their story that they had worked cleaning the health club that night. He said that he was at the athletic club until about 4 in the morning. So Raphael, in effect, corroborates Eddie and Jaime's version of events on the night of the 6th. So we kind of set them aside.
With Jaime and Eddie alibied, investigators turned to the autopsy report, hoping to find new leads.
It became very apparent just how violently he had died.
The medical examiner did find 3 blunt force blows to his skull.
The autopsy also showed that he had been shot 5 times. And then he had also been stabbed 5 times, very brutally, in the area of the heart.
The close cluster of the knife wounds directed at the heart did speak of extreme animosity, some violent emotion.
The gunshot wounds made it appear that his hands were up in a defensive gesture.
Gonzalo was likely pleading for some measure of mercy, and ultimately, none was to be had.
The autopsy report also determines that Gonzalo's death occurred around 10 p.m. With the findings in hand, investigators now turn to Gonzalo's workplace, searching for possible suspects.
We interviewed his supervisor. Gonzalo's boss described him as reliable, steady worker, punctual.
As detectives dig deeper, they learn about a startling new side to Gonzalo.
It appeared that he had a relationship with one of the security guards that worked there.
Gonzalo's boss did tell us there may have been some possible involvement between the security guard, Bobette, and Gonzalo. So we needed to look into it. We needed to interview her.
Police bring Bobette, Gonzalo's alleged girlfriend, in for questioning.
She was very upset about his death.
She was very emotional, very distraught about finding out that Gonzalo had been murdered, and ultimately disclosed that, in fact, she had had a very intimate relationship with Gonzalo for a couple months, but she made it very clear she wasn't in love with Gonzalo, and he wasn't in love with her.
Bobette described her relationship with Gonzalo as kind of a fling. It was kept secret. She understood that he was engaged to be married, but it crossed our minds that maybe Bobette's feelings were stronger than she let on.
Maybe she did not want this wedding to go forward.
The wedding was planned for September, only a few months away. Police asked Gonzalo's coworker about her movements on the day of the murder.
Bobette had been at several different locations that day, running errands, and she had receipts to support that. So she was ruled out as a suspect.
But while Bobette's cleared of suspicion, she hands detectives a crucial tip.
Bobette mentioned an ex-boyfriend named Oscar Rodriguez.
She told us Oscar was quite jealous.
He was extraordinarily jealous, apparently had been violently jealous in the past.
About 4 days before the murder, Oscar had found out about her relationship with Gonzalo. He became infuriated and began accusing her of cheating on him.
That could be a motive for Gonzalo's murder, so Oscar became a lead suspect.
Only 2 days into the investigation of the vicious murder of Gonzalo Pizano Guzman, police discover he was involved with his coworker, Bobette. Now she's pointed the finger at her jealous ex, Oscar Rodriguez.
She speculated that maybe he had something to do with it. We looked into him. He had a criminal history.
He'd been pretty extensively involved in gangs at that point in his life, and he was well known to the local police.
Very much an impulsive young man that was also involved in drug activity and drug use. Bobette told us that this was a relationship she had to escape from. She personally felt threatened by his presence and his behavior.
And she was very worried that perhaps he was the one that took some action towards Gonzalo.
Investigators uncover a troubling detail about Oscar's life.
It was discovered that Oscar Rodriguez's mother lived right next door to the victim's family.
The investigation kind of perked up as far as focusing in on Oscar, given the fact that he had such access to Gonzalo.
Detective suspicion grows further when they speak to Oscar himself.
When Oscar Rodriguez was interviewed, he lied to us and told us he had not had any contact at all with Bobette and didn't really know anything about what was going on. When we started to confront him that this was in contradiction to the information that we had from Bobette, he became furious, started yelling at us, "You don't trust me." He stated he had no claims to continue any relationship with Bobette, and he wanted to wash his hands of this entire investigation. Because of his nature, he just drew suspicion upon himself.
He was asked if he'd take a polygraph to show that he didn't have anything to do with Gonzalo's murder. He became very volatile and immediately demanded to end the interview.
And actually stormed out of the interview.
With Oscar not cooperating, detectives investigate his whereabouts during the time of the murder.
During this time frame, Oscar Rodriguez was actually serving a sentence in the restitution center.
The Restitution Center is a work-release facility for low to mid-level offenders, where Oscar could get passes to go out and find work.
So the question was, did Oscar have a pass at the date and time of the murder? Was it possible that he wasn't in the Restitution Center?
He is on a strict timeline. He had to check in, check out. It's a secure facility. The building is locked. There are alarms on all the doors and windows.
At the Restitution Center, there is a lockdown period at night until early in the morning.
After the records were examined, it was positively concluded that he was in the Restitution Center at the time Gonzalo was killed.
It was impossible for him to have been involved in the actual homicide.
And ultimately, he was ruled out as a suspect.
It's been a week since the murder, and the investigation is no closer to finding a suspect. Meanwhile, the family prepares to bury their beloved Gonzalo.
It was really hard on everybody. My mom decided she wanted to take him to Mexico. He was buried over there, and we all stayed for a while trying to grieve together as a family and process what had just happened to our family. My mom was just devastated.
It hurt me so much to lose Gonzalo. I was grieving deeply. I was in denial. I was in my own world. And I don't even know how I got by.
While the family grieves in Mexico, the community of Cornelius is feeling on edge.
There wasn't a quick arrest within a couple days or a week. This caused concern in the community because no one knew who did it.
Searching for new leads, detectives turn to the public.
We decided to put out a reward for information, and the idea was to get people to come forward if they knew anything and let them know that we're a little bit frustrated with where this investigation is going. We need public help.
Nearly 2 weeks after Gonzalo's murder, police get a tip that sends the investigation in a whole new direction.
We got a call from an employee of the SB gas station.
His name was Ryan Petty. He claimed that he had seen some graffiti written in the bathroom of the gas station. And the graffiti said, "Gonzalo Guzman, 12th Street Gang, please help, call the police."
And once he heard about the reward, he put Gonzalo with that name Gonzalo and recognized it must be the same victim who had left that cry for help on the wall.
Detectives rush to the gas station to interview Ryan. While interviewing him, he divulges a shocking revelation.
So what called his attention to the bathroom was shortly before he saw a car pull up, a white Monte Carlo, that had, in his words, skinheads in the vehicle.
One of them allegedly had a swastika tattooed on his body.
They were accompanying a very scared-looking Hispanic young man.
He stated that it looked like that Gonzalo may have been kidnapped. That was significant in the fact that we felt this was a big break that came in the case.
Nearly 2 weeks after Gonzalo Pizano Guzman was found brutally murdered, a gas station attendant named Ryan Petty has told police he saw Gonzalo with 3 suspicious men the night he was killed.
He described a carload of skinheads that had drove up and a young man in the back seat who appeared frightened, and they escorted him into the men's restroom for a short period of time.
He said that ultimately out of the bathroom, the Hispanic individual came out and they hustled him back into the car and drove away. Ryan Petty reported that when he went into the bathroom after an individual left it, he saw written on the wall, "Gonzalo Guzman, help, 12th Street Gang, call police."
But as detectives dig into Ryan's story, some details don't add up.
Had it been Gonzalo who had gone into that bathroom afraid for his life and put his name on the wall, he never would have written his name as Gonzalo Guzman.
We knew that was incorrect. He would not sign his name in that nature. That was the maternal name. He would have used the paternal name.
Guzman is his mother's name. he would have written his name as Gonzalo Pisano. Pisano's his father's name.
And so, right away, this was suspicious. And just the whole nature of what he was describing was more like something off of a TV show. The skinheads, the swastika. It just didn't ring true. And so it was suspected that he was trying to come forward for the reward. We looked through the videotape from the SB station during the period of time this employee stated that car had gone by. There was nothing in that videotape that corroborated anything he had told us.
No white Monte Carlo, no individuals who could be characterized as skinheads. More importantly, no individual who was a scared Hispanic person being escorted to the bathroom.
The examination of the surveillance video at the gas station contradicted Ryan Petty's version of events. And also, one of the issues was he didn't report this right away.
When police check Ryan's record, they find more troubling news.
He had a pretty checkered past.
He was no stranger to the criminal justice system.
Some of his arrests were for crimes that would cause you to doubt his honesty. In my mind, we ruled it out as pure fabrication. It just was too cute, too stereotypical. The mistake with the Spanish surname, I didn't buy it.
With another lead exhausted, investigators face a daunting realization.
We reached a point where we were getting nowhere. Leads weren't panning out.
Having no significant suspect is very depressing.
Really, if you don't solve these cases early on, the longer they go, the likelihood that you're actually going to be able to solve them becomes less and less.
In cases like this where we're not getting anywhere, especially on a homicide, we took this very personal. Up to that point, this team had not had an unresolved homicide.
The lack of progress also adds to the pain suffered by Gonzalo's family.
It was very hard. It was very painful to come back from Mexico and there was no arrest yet.
Fue algo fuerte para mí, mucho dolor. Tenía mucho coraje y mucho odio en mi corazón.
Everything was very silent and we were getting very, very impatient. My mom was getting very impatient with the detectives and all they told us is to please trust them. So we put our life in their hands.
2 more months pass without an arrest. With the case at a standstill, detectives review the entire investigation for something they may have missed.
It can be very frustrating when you reach that point where you've kind of hit the wall, but you just have to resolve to redouble your efforts and to keep digging, keep pushing.
It was time to go back and look over everybody one more time. We knew that Eddie and Jaime were the last people to see Gonzalo at Sol's house the night of the murder.
Even though they'd been interviewed and gave a pretty good account of their activity that night, their boss, Rafael, provided an alibi for them. We wanted to be sure. So at this stage is when we asked them to take a polygraph. But when we began to ask them to take a polygraph, they started dodging and weaving.
For some reason, they began to balk, and this threw a red flag as to why they weren't coming forward. Again, these are the last 2 people to see Gonzalo alive, and now they're getting cold feet about taking a polygraph exam.
And that's when we really started to think something was wrong.
Detectives keep the pressure on Jaime and Eddie, and on September 14th, Eddie comes in for his polygraph.
The polygrapher was hooking Eddie up, attaching these leads to him to measure his response. And he doesn't even get to the questions. And Eddie says, "Okay, I'll tell you what happened."
And he immediately makes it clear that he wants to tell everything that happened.
In police parlance, he spilled it.
Two months after the murder of Gonzalo Pisano Guzman, detectives are re-interviewing witnesses, hoping for a break. Now, Eddie, one of the last people to see Gonzalo alive, has told police he knows more than he's let on.
He gave a detailed, recorded statement about what happened on the night of the murder.
As he talks to investigators, Eddie drops a bombshell.
He disclosed that he had actually been approached by his boss, Raphael, who was Saul's brother, to coordinate delivering Gonzalo to the Forest Hills Country Club parking lot.
Eddie told us that it had all been planned out by Raphael. Raphael had enlisted Joe Noble to help with this crime. Joe was Raphael's friend. Eddie went on to tell us that night he and Jaime lured Gonzalo to drive his car to the golf course. And as they pulled up, Joe Noble appeared with a gun in his hand. And as Eddie and Jaime got out of Gonzalo's car, Noble got into the car, pointing the gun at Gonzalo. And also present in the parking lot was Raphael and his white Ford F-150.
Gonzalo was driven away by Raphael and Joe, but Eddie claims he has no idea what happened next.
He stated that he and Jaime had left the country club and got into their vehicle, left and went home and went to work as usual.
Could the brother of Gonzalo's fiancée, Saul, really be behind his brutal murder?
It was extremely surprising to suddenly see Rafael Mora as somebody different than this really incredibly self-possessed 19-year-old who started his own business.
But according to Eddie, Raphael leads a disturbing double life.
Eddie told us that Raphael was a pretty active drug dealer.
The nice entrepreneur cover of Raphael was all a lie. He's a significant drug dealer, and it appears orchestrated the kidnapping of Gonzalo with Joe Noble.
This completely surprised me. Raphael did appear, at least on the surface, to be legit, and now he's not who we thought he was.
It was a shock to all of us.
The one thing detectives still need to know is why Raphael would want to kill his future brother-in-law.
Up to that point in time, there was nothing to link him. There was no motive that anybody could speak of.
Investigators first turned their attention to Joe Noble, suspecting he may have been taking orders from Raphael.
Joe Noble was known as a small-time criminal. An informant told us he was very concerned about a .40 caliber pistol he had sold to Joe Noble. And he suspected that this may have been the murder weapon used in the killing of Gonzalo.
That's not the last of the informant's revelations.
He said that Joe Noble had talked to a female at one of the local bars and had asked her to alibi for him on the particular night in question.
We contacted her. She told us that yes, Joe had asked her to say he was with her on the night of the 6th, and most importantly, she said I wasn't with him.
Police bring Joe in for questioning.
Joe denied having any involvement whatsoever to the murder.
During our interview with Joe, he actually tried to use the alibi, and then when we confronted him with the fact that we'd already talked to her and she said it was all BS, then he stopped talking.
Joel stated that he wanted an attorney and didn't want to talk anymore.
With nothing concrete to hold Joe, police are forced to release him and turn their attention to Raphael.
Investigators learned that Raphael's cleaning business was not all that it was purported to be. He had a contract with the Hawthorne Farms Athletic Club.
The manager of the health club was not very impressed with the quality of Raphael's work and the work of his crew.
It was really a shoddy operation, by all accounts.
We considered the fact that the cleaning company may have been a front for Raphael's drug dealing.
Raphael told police he was cleaning the gym with Eddie and Jaime the night of Gonzalo's murder, so investigators checked with management in order to corroborate his alibi.
The manager of the club said he often couldn't reach him, so we had no idea if he was there or not on the night of the murder.
With his alibi falling apart, detectives asked Raphael's sister, Saul, why he might want Gonzalo dead.
Saul admitted that Raphael had had a serious talk with her and that it was clear that he was opposed to the wedding, felt she was too young.
Raphael did not want Gonzalo marrying Saul.
Just did not see Gonzalo as being worthy of marrying into the family. Investigators learned that Raphael would mock Gonzalo for the car he drove. He'd mock him for bringing over a bottle of wine to his parents that was cheap and not any good.
Raphael held an extreme dislike for Gonzalo. When accompanied by friends, he would go by Gonzalo's car and talk about keying it or smashing a window out and laughing about it.
With the evidence against Raphael stacking up, police are ready to bring him in for an interview. But there's just one setback.
He disappeared. At this point, it's become pretty apparent that Raphael's got something to hide. When you put it all together, there was probable cause to arrest him.
With a warrant for Raphael's arrest, police initiate a manhunt.
He had a girlfriend named Sandy Montez. We found him hiding at his girlfriend's house. He had dyed his hair orange, and it was obvious that he had done it to try to change his identity.
On September 28, 2000, Raphael is officially charged with first-degree kidnapping and aggravated murder.
I was like in shock. I had so much anger at Raphael. It's an anger I can't explain.
Just when police believe they have their man, the investigation takes another shocking turn.
We had Raphael in custody when his girlfriend showed up with evidence stating that there was no way he could have been at the murder scene. This raised some obvious concerns.
Could it be possible that Raphael was not involved in Gonzalo's murder?
It came as an absolute surprise.
Police have arrested Rafael Mora in the death of his sister's fiancé, Gonzalo Pizano Guzman. But now, Rafael's girlfriend, Cindy, claims she has an alibi for him on the night of the murder.
Cindy produced a receipt from a auto detailing place that purported to have dropped off Raphael's vehicle the night of the murder, and that Raphael was there and signed for it. It was presented as a solid piece of evidence that Raphael was working at the athletic club the night in question, and they had the receipt to prove it. And an individual named Cassandra, who owned the company, had signed off and was going to be an alibi witness.
Checking the validity of the receipt, police interview Cassandra, who admits to being a friend of Raphael.
With a little bit of prodding by the investigators, she finally admitted that, in fact, the receipt was fake.
She confessed it was all a lie, orchestrated by Raphael.
It was something that she dummied up because Raphael had asked her to.
With Raphael's alibi discredited, investigators turn up the heat on co-conspirator Joe Noble.
He told the officers that he hadn't been completely honest.
He admitted that he was at the parking lot at the golf course. He was there when the car was burned. He admits the kidnap. He admits to pistol whipping the victim.
He said that it was Raphael ordering him to do that. They then picked up Gonzalo, put him in the back of a Ford white pickup truck.
And then Raphael drove Joe home with the victim knocked out in the back of the truck.
But when he last saw Gonzalo, albeit knocked out, was still alive.
And then supposedly Raphael would have then driven back out to Hag Lake and killed Gonzalo.
Detectives have a hard time believing Joe was not there when Gonzalo was finally killed, but have no proof.
We had no physical evidence that we could link them to the crime, and it was frustrating.
Desperate, investigators obtain security footage from businesses along the route they believe Raphael and Joe would have taken to and from the murder. Something on one of the tapes grabs their attention.
We saw Raphael's pickup pull into the gas station to get gas.
And lo and behold, there's Joseph Noble getting out of the white Ford and going into the gas station.
And the timing of the gas station surveillance footage indicated that would have been probably shortly after the murder.
Police also obtain a warrant for Raphael's phone records.
Raphael insisted all along that he couldn't have committed the murder because he was miles away cleaning the gym. And lo and behold, at the time of the murder, His phone was not bouncing off the nearest tower to the athletic club. It was bouncing off the nearest tower to Hag Lake, which puts him in the area of the murder. That was huge.
I felt ecstatic because I knew in that moment that we had him, and it absolutely, conclusively meant that his alibi at the athletic club was false.
This was a big moment of actually having some physical evidence.
There's a great deal of satisfaction, too, having found the truth.
With the new evidence in hand, prosecutors are confident they can secure a conviction. And in 2003, Joe Noble and Rafael Mora are tried together.
Both were charged with aggravated murder and with kidnapping in the first degree.
At trial, prosecutors present a picture of what they believe happened to Gonzalo the night he was murdered.
Rafael did not want him marrying his sister.
Rafael was determined to have Gonzalo killed.
And so he hatched a plan to get Gonzalo out to the golf course.
Lured Gonzalo out there with Eddie and Jaime.
After getting out of the car, Gonzalo was beat and pistol whipped and thrown into the back seat of the pickup. Rafael or Joe then set the car on fire and they proceeded to Hag Lake.
They drove to an isolated spot. Gonzalo got out of the car. The gun was pointed at him.
We believe that he was shot multiple times by Joe and that Rafael was the one that wanted to get the final word in and stabbed him multiple times in the heart.
On the stand, a witness reveals Rafael bragged to him about the murder.
That Gonzalo was begging for his life, that Gonzalo was promising that he would stop the relationship with Saul, that he would move to Mexico.
Mató a mi hijo de esa manera tan cruel. Gonzalo no se merecía esa muerte tan fuerte, nada más para que no se casara con Marisol.
No one deserves to be killed that way. No one. It was so senseless. It was so senseless.
On April 28, 2003, the jury finds Rafael and Joe guilty of Gonzalo's murder.
Joe was sentenced to life with a possibility of parole after 25 years. Rafael was sentenced to straight life, no possibility of parole.
After 5 years in prison, Rafael appeals his conviction, arguing ineffective counsel.
The judge decided that this case should go back to trial, which was a shock to all of us.
Ultimately, the decision was made to allow Rafael to plead to manslaughter in the first degree.
Rafael's sentence is reduced to 25 years and 10 months. With time served, he will be eligible for early release in 2024.
He had no remorse, he had no guilt. He's a monster. What he did to us changed our life forever. He destroyed us.
Even after everything they've endured, Gonzalo's family remains inspired by his memory.
Yo lloré por muchos años, mucho tiempo, y un día yo lo soñé. Yo estoy bien, ma. No llores por mí. Yo estoy muy bien. Y yo lo miré riéndose y me dijo que ya no llorara por él, que él estaba bien, que él estaba en paz.
He was a happy person that wanted everybody around him to have that same joy and made sure that we were always laughing. Those are the moments that I will always cherish the most. Gonzalo was one of the most genuine men that I've known, that I continue to admire.